carriage wheel snapped just outside the gates of Ravenswood, and Alexander Ashcombe felt his heart slam against his chest before the vehicle even came to a stop. It was not the broken wheel that frightened him. It was the sight of the manor rising through the mist, exactly as he had left it 5 years ago, as if time itself had refused to move without him. He stepped down onto the gravel path, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground, and for a long moment he simply stood there, staring at the iron gates that had once been his prison and his home. The driver muttered something about needing an hour to fix the wheel, but Alexander barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the long avenue of oak trees that led to the front door. Trees he had climbed as a boy, trees under which he had once promised a woman named Elena Whitmore that he would never leave her. He had broken that promise. He had left without a word, without a letter that ever reached her, and he had spent 5 years trying to convince himself that leaving had been the right choice. Standing here now, with the cold morning air biting at his face, he was no longer sure of anything. A groundskeeper he did not recognize hurried toward him, eyes wide with surprise. "Your Grace," the man said, bowing quickly. "We did not expect you until next week." "Plans change," Alexander said simply, though the truth was far more complicated than that. He had received a letter from his solicitor 3 days earlier, a letter that mentioned, almost in passing, a boy living on the edge of the estate who bore a striking resemblance to the Ashcombe family. Alexander had read that single line so many times, the paper had begun to tear along the fold. He walked through the gates without waiting for his luggage, needing to move, needing to feel his own legs carrying him forward, instead of standing frozen in memory. The manor loomed closer with every step, its gray stone walls covered in ivy that had grown thicker since he last saw it. Windows he remembered as dark and empty now, glowed faintly with candlelight, though it was barely past dawn. Mrs. Dunmore, the housekeeper who had cared for this house since before Alexander was born, met him at the door with a look of shock that quickly softened into relief. "You have come home," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We had almost given up hope of seeing you again." "I could not stay away any longer," Alexander answered, though even he did not know exactly what had pulled him back. Was it duty to his family's title, now that his father had passed? Or was it the single line in that letter, the mention of a child with gray eyes just like his own? He did not ask Mrs. Dunmore directly. He was afraid of what she might say, afraid of confirming something he had only allowed himself to suspect in the quiet hours of the night. Instead, he asked her to have his old rooms prepared, and walked past her into the entrance hall, where portraits of his ancestors watched him with the same stern expressions they always had. That first day passed in a blur of unpacking, of meetings with the estate manager about crops and tenants and repairs long overdue, of forcing himself to appear calm and composed in front of servants who clearly sensed something troubled him. By evening, he could bear the waiting no longer. He changed into simpler clothes, the kind a gentleman might wear for a quiet ride, and made his way to the stables. The horse he chose was a dark bay mare named Willow, gentle and familiar, even after all these years. As he mounted her and rode out past the manor's formal gardens, he told himself he was simply exploring the estate, reacquainting himself with land he had not walked in half a decade. He told himself this was not about finding anyone in particular. But his hands guided the horse toward the eastern edge of the property, toward the old orchard where apple trees grew in neat rows, and toward the small cottage that sat just beyond it, the one that had belonged to the estate's herbalist for as long as he could remember. The evening light was turning gold when he reached the orchard, and it was there, among the trees heavy with early summer fruit, that he saw the boy. The child could not have been more than 5 years old, with a mop of dark hair and a small wooden sword in his hand, swinging it at imaginary enemies with the fierce concentration only children possess. Alexander slowed his horse to a stop at the edge of the trees, watching, unable to look away. The boy noticed him almost immediately. Children have a way of sensing when they are being watched, and this one turned with the sword still raised, ready to defend his imaginary kingdom from any intruder. But when his eyes met Alexander's, the wooden sword lowered slowly, and the boy's small face tilted with open curiosity. "You have gray eyes," the boy said, without any greeting or introduction, in the blunt and honest way that only children can manage. "Just like mine." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He dismounted slowly, keeping a careful distance, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain the boy could hear it. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking than he had feared. The same gray eyes, yes, but also the same shape of the jaw, the same slight curve at the corner of the mouth when something amused him. "What is your name?" Alexander asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "Thomas," the boy said proudly, puffing out his small chest. "I am 5 years old, and I am the bravest knight in all of Ravenswood." "Is that so?" Alexander managed a small smile, though his chest felt tight with an emotion he could not yet name. "And where is your mother, brave knight?" Thomas pointed toward the cottage with his wooden sword. "She is inside making medicine for Mrs. Dunmore's bad knee. She always says I must not wander too far, but the orchard is not far at all." Alexander's eyes moved to the cottage, and for a moment he considered walking toward it, knocking on the door, facing the truth that had been building inside him since he read that letter. But fear held him in place, the same fear that had driven him away 5 years ago, and he found himself unable to take even a single step in that direction. "Have you always lived here?" Alexander asked instead, crouching down slightly to be closer to the boy's height. "Since before I remember," Thomas answered matter-of-factly. "Mama says we live here because she works for the Duke, but I have never seen the Duke. Mrs. Dunmore says he went away a long time ago and never came back." The words struck Alexander like a physical blow. He straightened up quickly, running a hand through his hair, suddenly desperate to leave before the conversation could go any further, before this small boy with his own eyes could ask a question he was not ready to answer. "I should let you return to your battles," Alexander said, forcing lightness into his voice that he did not feel. "A knight as brave as you surely has enemies waiting." Thomas grinned, seemingly satisfied with this explanation, and turned back toward the trees, already lost again in his imaginary world. Alexander watched him for one more moment, memorizing the way the boy moved, the way he laughed at nothing in particular, before he forced himself to mount his horse and ride away. He did not go far. Just beyond the orchard's edge, hidden by a cluster of birch trees, he stopped Willow and sat there, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. The math was simple enough, and he had done it 100 times in his mind over the past 3 days since receiving that letter. Thomas was 5 years old. Alexander had left Ravenswood 5 years and 2 months ago. Elena Whitmore, the woman he had loved and abandoned, had never married. He was almost certain now, though certainty brought him no comfort. If Thomas was his son, then he had missed nearly everything. The first breath, the first word, the first unsteady steps across a cottage floor. He had missed all of it because he had been too much of a coward to face his own family's disapproval, too willing to let others make his choices for him. The sound of hoofbeats behind him made him turn sharply, and he found himself face to face with Edward Blackwood, an old friend, and now the estate's steward, riding toward him with a look of concern. "Mrs. Dunmore told me you had ridden out alone," Edward said, pulling his horse alongside Alexander's. "I worried you might have lost your way. You have been gone a long time, after all." "I have not lost my way," Alexander replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I have simply been remembering things I tried very hard to forget." Edward's expression softened with understanding, and he glanced briefly in the direction of the cottage before looking back at his friend. "You saw the boy," he said quietly. It was not a question. Alexander nodded once, unable to trust his voice. "Everyone on the estate has whispered about it for years," Edward continued gently. "The resemblance is impossible to miss, though no one dared say it directly. Not with your mother still holding such influence over the household staff. Elena has kept to herself, raised the boy alone, and asked for nothing from anyone." "Why did no one write to me?" Alexander demanded, anger rising suddenly to cover the guilt clawing at his insides. "Why did I have to learn of this through a single careless line in a solicitor's letter? Would you have believed a letter, coming from strangers, telling you such a thing?" Edward asked, not unkindly. "Or would you have dismissed it as gossip, as your mother certainly would have wished you to?" Alexander had no answer for that. He knew his own stubbornness too well, knew how easily he might have convinced himself the rumor was false if it had reached him through anyone other than his own eyes. He looked back toward the cottage, now barely visible through the trees, and felt the full weight of 5 lost years pressing down upon him. "I need to speak with her," he said finally. "Then speak with her," Edward answered. "But be certain of what you intend to say before you knock on that door, Alexander. Elena has built a quiet life here, difficult as it has been. She deserves more than a duke arriving on her doorstep out of guilt alone. The words stayed with Alexander long after Edward rode back toward the manor, leaving him alone once more with his thoughts and the fading light. He did not approach the cottage that evening. Instead, he rode the long way back, taking the path that wound past the old chapel and the small graveyard where his father now rested, needing time to gather himself before facing what awaited him. By the time he returned to the manor, darkness had fully settled over Ravenswood, and the candles in the windows glowed like small warnings against the night. He handed Willow's reins to a stable boy and walked slowly toward the house, his mind still full of gray eyes and wooden swords, and a name he could not stop repeating. Thomas. He said it under his breath as he climbed the front steps, testing the weight of it, trying to imagine a future where that name belonged to him as much as it belonged to Elena. He did not know yet what kind of father he could be, or whether Elena would ever allow him close enough to try. He did not know how his mother, the formidable Duchess Beatrice Ashcombe, would react when she learned the truth, though he suspected it would not be with kindness. What he did know, standing there in the doorway of the home he had once fled, was that he could not leave again, not this time. Whatever waited for him in the days ahead, whatever anger or grief or difficult conversations he would have to face, he owed it to that small boy in the orchard to stay and find out the truth. Inside, Mrs. Dunmore was waiting, with a simple supper and a worried expression that told him she already suspected where his ride had taken him. She said nothing about it directly, only asked if he wished to eat in the dining hall or in his study, and Alexander chose the study, needing solitude more than he needed company. He sat by the fire long after the meal had gone cold, staring into the flames, replaying the moment those gray eyes had looked up at him with such open curiosity. Somewhere across the estate, in a small cottage beside an orchard, a woman he had once loved was likely putting that same boy to bed, unaware that the man she had spent 5 years trying to forget was now lying awake in the same house where their story had first begun. Tomorrow, Alexander decided, he would find the courage to knock on her door. Tonight, he would simply sit with the truth he had finally allowed himself to see, and try to prepare himself for everything that truth would demand of him in the days to come. The fire had burned low by the time Mrs. Dunmore returned to the study, carrying a small tray with tea he had not requested. She set it down quietly on the side table and lingered near the door, as though uncertain whether she was welcome to speak or expected to leave in silence. "You may say what is on your mind," Alexander said, without looking away from the flames. "You have known me since I was younger than that boy in the orchard. I imagine there is very little you would say that could surprise me tonight." Mrs. Dunmore folded her hands in front of her apron, choosing her words with the same care she had always shown, even when he was a restless child, demanding honesty from every corner of the household. "Elena Whitmore has never asked this family for anything, Your Grace," she said gently. "Not coin, not favor, not even acknowledgement. She has worked for her place on this estate every single day, and she has raised that boy with more patience and love than many mothers twice her age could manage. I do not doubt her character," Alexander said quietly. "I doubt my own. I left without explanation, without so much as a letter that reached her hands, and I allowed 5 years to pass believing I had made a wise decision. Now I return to find a boy with my own eyes, swinging a wooden sword among the apple trees, and I do not know how to begin making amends for what I have taken from him." "Perhaps you begin simply," Mrs. Dunmore offered, "by being present tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day following. Children do not require grand speeches or perfect apologies. They require someone who stays." Her words settled over him like a quiet weight, neither comforting nor cruel, simply true. He thanked her for the tea, though he did not touch it, and sat alone once the door had closed softly behind her, listening to the old house settle around him the way it always had, creaking gently as though the walls themselves remembered every secret ever kept within them. He thought of his father then, gone now for nearly 2 years, and wondered what the old Duke would have said if he had lived long enough to learn of Thomas's existence. His father had been a stern man, proud of the family name above almost everything else, yet Alexander remembered moments of unexpected softness as well, quiet afternoons spent teaching him to ride, patient lessons in the estate ledgers that his father insisted every future duke must understand thoroughly. Would his father have welcomed a grandson born outside of marriage, or would he have demanded the same silence and distance that Alexander's mother would surely insist upon? He did not know, and there was no use pretending the answer mattered now. His father was gone, and the decisions ahead belonged entirely to Alexander alone, whether he felt prepared for them or not. Sleep did not come easily that night. He lay in his old bedroom, staring at the same ceiling he had stared at as a younger man, listening to the wind moving through the oak trees outside his window. Every time his eyes began to close, he saw Thomas again, sword raised high, gray eyes narrowed in fierce concentration, utterly unaware of the storm his simple existence had stirred inside the man who had just ridden into his small kingdom. By the time dawn crept over the hills surrounding Ravenswood, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Alexander had made his decision. He would not wait for courage to arrive on its own, because he suspected it never truly would. Some choices simply had to be made before a person felt ready for them, and this was one such choice. He rose from his bed, dressed simply, and stood at his window, watching the mist lift slowly from the orchard in the distance, knowing that somewhere beneath those same trees, a boy who did not yet understand what his arrival meant was likely already awake, ready for another day of imaginary battles. Today, Alexander told himself, he would finally walk the rest of the way to that cottage door. Today, he would face Elena Whitmore, and whatever anger, grief, or forgiveness she chose to offer him, he would accept it as the beginning of trying to become the father that small boy deserved, and the man he should have been all along. Elena Whitmore's hands trembled as she ground the dried lavender in her stone mortar, though the tremor had nothing to do with the early morning chill still clinging to her small kitchen. Word had reached her before sunrise, carried by a breathless kitchen maid who could barely get the words out fast enough. The Duke had returned, not next week, as everyone had believed, but yesterday, riding through the gates as though 5 years had never passed at all. She had not slept since hearing the news. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alexander's face as it had looked the last time she saw him in person, pale and distant, already halfway gone even as he stood before her, promising nothing had changed between them. She had believed him then. She had been a fool to believe him. The knock at her door came just as the sun cleared the tops of the apple trees, sharp and deliberate, nothing like the gentle taps of village neighbors, or the playful pounding of Thomas's small fists when he forgot his key. Elena set down the mortar carefully, wiped her hands on her apron, and forced her breathing to steady before crossing the small room. She opened the door and found herself face to face with the man she had spent 5 years trying to forget. Alexander looked older, certainly, lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before. But his gaze held the same intensity she remembered, the same way of looking at her as though nothing else in the world existed in that moment. For a long stretch of silence, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently through the orchard behind him, rustling leaves that seemed to be the only sound brave enough to fill the space between them. "Elena," he said finally, her name rough in his throat, as though he had practiced saying it 100 times through the night, and still could not manage it smoothly. "Your Grace," she replied, deliberately formal, deliberately cold, though her heart pounded so violently she feared he might hear it. "I did not expect a visit from the Duke himself. Surely there are matters of the estate far more pressing than an herbalist's cottage." "Do not do that," Alexander said quietly, something close to pain crossing his features. "Do not speak to me as though I am a stranger." "You made yourself a stranger," Elena answered, her voice sharpening, despite her effort to remain calm. "You left without a word, Alexander. 5 years, and not a single letter, not a single message through anyone who might have carried one. I waited for months believing you would return, or at the very least explain yourself, and instead, I received nothing but silence. I wrote to you," he said, and the desperation in his voice made her pause despite herself. "I wrote more letters than I can count, Elena. I do not know what became of them, but I swear to you, I did not simply vanish without trying to reach you." Elena stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit, finding none, though that uncertainty only made her chest ache more fiercely. If he had truly written, then someone had ensured those letters never reached her, and she did not need to search far to imagine who might have done such a thing. The Duchess Beatrice Ashcombe had made her opinion of Elena clear long before Alexander ever left Ravenswood, opinions rooted entirely in the difference between their stations in life. "It does not matter now," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. "Whatever happened, whatever letters were sent or lost, You are here now for reasons that have nothing to do with me. Please state your business, Your Grace, so that I may return to my work." Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might simply turn and walk away, retreating behind the same wall of duty and distance that had defined him before. Instead, he took a small step closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion behind his eyes. "I met a boy in the orchard yesterday evening," he said softly. "A boy with gray eyes, who told me quite proudly that he was the bravest knight in all of Ravenswood." The color drained from Elena's face. She had known this moment would come eventually, had prepared herself for it in 100 imagined conversations over the years, yet standing here now, facing the reality of it, every rehearsed response abandoned her completely. "His name is Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Alexander answered. "He told me himself." Silence stretched between them again, heavier this time, filled with everything neither of them had said aloud in 5 long years. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the morning sun, and forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "What do you want from us, Alexander?" she asked. "Have you come to claim him, now that it is convenient, now that your father has passed, and the title sits fully upon your shoulders? Or have you come to warn me that your mother will not tolerate such an inconvenient truth becoming known?" "I have come because he is my son," Alexander said, the words finally spoken aloud after a lifetime of unspoken suspicion between them. "And I have spent one sleepless night realizing exactly how much of his life I have already missed." Elena's composure cracked at last, tears gathering in her eyes, though she fought fiercely to hold them back. "You do not know what these 5 years have been like," she said, her voice trembling with an anger that had clearly been building far longer than this single conversation. "I raised him alone, Alexander. I endured whispers in the village, cold looks from women, who once called themselves my friends, the constant fear that I would lose my position here entirely, if your mother decided I had become too much of an embarrassment to keep employed. I did all of this while you lived comfortably wherever you chose to disappear to, free of any consequence at all." "I was not free of consequence," Alexander said, his own voice rising slightly with an emotion he clearly struggled to contain. "I have spent every single day since I left, wondering if I made the right choice, wondering what became of you, wondering whether my mother's threats against my inheritance were worth the cost of staying away from the only woman I ever truly loved." The words hung between them, raw and unguarded, and for a moment, Elena saw not the Duke standing before her, but the young man she had fallen in love with beneath these very apple trees, before titles and duties and cruel mothers had ever entered their lives. "You could have chosen differently," she said quietly. "You could have chosen us." "I know," Alexander admitted, and the simple honesty of it seemed to cost him more than any grand speech could have. "I was young, and afraid, and far too willing to let my mother's threats decide my future for me. I cannot undo those choices now, Elena. I can only tell you that I intend to be present for Thomas from this day forward, in whatever way you will allow." Before Elena could respond, the sound of small footsteps came racing around the side of the cottage, and Thomas appeared, breathless and grinning, his wooden sword clutched tightly in one hand, and a handful of wildflowers crushed in the other. "Mama, look what I found," he announced proudly, then stopped short upon seeing Alexander standing at the door. His small face lit up with immediate recognition. "You came back. Are you here to see my kingdom again?" Elena's eyes flew to Alexander's face, searching for any hint of how he intended to answer. Her heart caught somewhere between fear and a desperate hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Alexander crouched down slightly, meeting Thomas's eyes with a gentle smile that did not quite mask the emotion trembling beneath it. "I would like that very much," Alexander said softly, "if your mother permits it." All eyes turned to Elena, and she found herself standing at a crossroads she had never truly prepared for, no matter how many nights she had spent imagining this exact moment. Behind her stood 5 years of hurt and betrayal, still raw despite the passage of time. Before her stood the man responsible for that hurt, offering something she had long since stopped hoping for, a chance for her son to know his father. "Thomas," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady for her son's sake, even as her mind raced through every possible consequence. "Why do you not show the Duke your collection of stones by the stream? I need a few moments to speak with him privately first." Thomas nodded eagerly, clearly delighted at the prospect of an audience for his prized possessions, and dashed off toward the stream that ran along the orchard's edge, leaving Elena and Alexander alone once more. "You cannot simply appear and disappear as it suits you," Elena said firmly, once she was certain her son was out of earshot. "If you intend to be part of his life, it must be a true commitment, not a passing curiosity that fades once the novelty wears away. I will not watch him grow attached to a father who might vanish again without explanation." "I understand," Alexander said, and there was nothing but sincerity in his expression now. "I am not asking for forgiveness today, Elena. I know I have not earned that, and perhaps I never fully will. I am only asking for the chance to prove, through my actions rather than my words, that I intend to remain." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing 5 years of pain against the small flicker of hope she could not quite extinguish, no matter how hard she tried. Finally, she gave a small, cautious nod. "You may see him," she said, "but you will earn his trust slowly, and mine even more slowly than that. And you must understand, Alexander, that your mother will not accept this quietly once she learns of it. She has never wanted anything to do with me, and she will want even less to do with my son, inheriting any part of what she considers rightfully hers." "Let me worry about my mother," Alexander said, though a shadow crossed his face at the mention of the Duchess, a shadow that told Elena he understood exactly how difficult that particular battle would be. "For now, I simply want to know my son." They walked together toward the stream, where Thomas had already begun arranging his collection of smooth stones into careful patterns, chattering happily to himself about the merits of each one. Alexander sat down on the grass beside him, without a moment's hesitation, listening intently as Thomas explained, in great detail, which stones made the best skipping rocks, and which ones simply looked beautiful in the sunlight. Elena stood back and watched them together, father and son, and felt something complicated tighten in her chest, equal parts fear and fragile, unexpected hope. She did not yet know what the coming weeks would bring, or how long Alexander's resolve would last once the full weight of his family's disapproval descended upon him. But watching Thomas laugh at something Alexander had said, watching the boy's gray eyes shine with delight at finally having someone new to share his small kingdom with, she allowed herself, for the first time in 5 long years, to imagine a future where things might actually turn out well for all of them. Thomas held up a flat gray stone, turning it over in his small hands with great seriousness. "This one is my favorite," he told Alexander. "It skips 6 times if you throw it just right. Papa Edward showed me how, but he says his best throw only ever managed 5. Alexander's chest tightened at the casual mention of another man's name, attached so easily to the word Papa, though he understood immediately that Thomas meant no harm by it, and likely used the title simply because Edward Blackwood had spent time teaching him small skills a father might otherwise teach. Still, the ache of it settled deep, a reminder of exactly how much time had already slipped away without him. "Would you like to see if I can beat 5? Alexander asked, keeping his voice light despite the emotion churning beneath it. Thomas's eyes widened with excitement, and he thrust the stone into Alexander's hand at once. "You have to hold it flat, like this," the boy instructed, demonstrating with an invisible stone of his own, his small fingers curling with great concentration, "and you throw it low, not high, or it just plops in like a rock instead of skipping like a proper stone should." Alexander followed the instructions carefully, crouching low beside the water's edge, and sent the stone skimming across the surface. It skipped 4 times before sinking beneath the gentle current, and Thomas let out a groan of disappointment on his behalf. "That was close," the boy said generously. "You will get it next time. It took me nearly all summer to learn." "Then I suppose I have some catching up to do," Alexander said, and though the words were meant lightly, they carried a weight only he and Elena, watching quietly from a few steps away, truly understood. They spent nearly an hour by the stream, Thomas moving from stones to a story about a fox he had once seen crossing the orchard at dawn, then to an elaborate explanation of the imaginary kingdom he ruled over among the apple trees. Alexander listened to every word, as though it were the most important information he had ever received, asking questions at just the right moments, laughing genuinely at the boy's dramatic descriptions of his imaginary battles against invisible dragons. Elena remained mostly silent throughout, watching the careful, tentative bond forming before her eyes. torn between the protective instinct that had guarded her son fiercely for 5 years, and the quiet, undeniable joy of seeing him so happy in his father's presence. When the church bell in the distant village tower rang out the hour, she finally stepped forward. "Thomas, it is time for your lessons with Mrs. Fairweather," she said gently. "She will be waiting for you at the schoolhouse." Thomas groaned dramatically, the universal sound of a child being pulled away from something far more enjoyable than arithmetic, but he gathered his stones into his pocket without further argument, clearly accustomed to the routine. Before running off toward the path that led to the village, he paused and looked back at Alexander with open, uncomplicated hope. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked. "I want to show you the fox's den, if we can find it again." "I would like nothing more," Alexander said, and meant it with every part of himself. Once Thomas had disappeared down the path, his small figure growing smaller among the trees, the easy warmth between Elena and Alexander cooled slightly, replaced by the more complicated reality of what lay ahead. "He is a remarkable boy," Alexander said quietly, still watching the empty path where his son had vanished. "You have raised him well, Elena, despite everything working against you." "I raised him because I had no other choice," Elena replied, though there was less sharpness in her tone now than there had been earlier. "But thank you. It has not been easy, and there were many nights I feared I was failing him entirely." "You did not fail him," Alexander said firmly. "I am the one who failed him, and I intend to spend whatever time is necessary correcting that mistake, if you will allow it." Elena studied him for a long moment, the morning sun casting long shadows through the orchard around them. "Time will tell whether your intentions hold, Alexander," she said finally. "For now, I ask only that you tread carefully. Thomas has already noticed the absence of a father his entire life. If you enter his world and then vanish again, the damage will be far worse than if you had never returned at all." "I understand the risk," Alexander said, "and I accept it fully. I am not going anywhere this time, Elena, whatever it costs me." She did not respond to that directly, though something in her expression softened slightly, a crack in the careful armor she had built around herself over 5 long years. She turned back toward her cottage, leaving Alexander standing alone by the stream, watching the water move steadily past the smooth stones Thomas had left scattered along its bank. He rode back toward the manor slowly, his mind replaying every moment of the morning, every word Thomas had spoken, every small gesture that reminded him so painfully of the years he had already lost. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he nearly did not notice the messenger waiting at the manor's front steps, a young man in unfamiliar livery holding a sealed letter bearing his mother's distinctive crest. Alexander's stomach tightened as he dismounted and accepted the letter, recognizing immediately the sharp, elegant handwriting that had directed so much of his life before he finally found the courage to leave it behind. The Duchess Beatrice Ashcombe wrote rarely, and never without purpose. He broke the seal standing right there on the front steps, unwilling to wait even the few minutes it would take to reach the privacy of his study. The letter was brief, as his mother's letters always were, every word chosen with careful precision, to inflict maximum effect with minimum length. "It has come to my attention that you have returned to Ravenswood ahead of schedule," the letter began, without any greeting or pleasantry. "I trust this sudden urgency has nothing to do with certain rumors regarding the herbalist child that have reached even my ears in London. I shall arrive within the fortnight to discuss matters of the estate, and I expect this particular rumor to have resolved itself entirely by the time I do." Alexander read the words twice, his jaw clenching with a mixture of anger and dread. His mother had never been a woman to make idle threats, and the coldness of her phrasing told him exactly how she intended this situation to resolve itself, whether he agreed with her methods or not. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat, his earlier warmth from the morning's visit to the orchard, now tempered by the cold reality awaiting him. Whatever peace he had begun to build with Elena and Thomas, whatever fragile trust he had started to earn, it would soon collide directly with the formidable will of a woman who had never once bent to anyone's wishes but her own. He looked back toward the orchard, now hidden from view behind the manor's tall hedges, and made a silent promise to himself. Whatever his mother intended, whatever pressure she brought to bear in the coming weeks, he would not abandon his son a second time. The fortnight ahead would test every ounce of resolve he possessed, and he intended to meet it fully prepared, regardless of the cost. A sharp knock on the cottage door startled Elena so badly that she nearly dropped the jar of dried chamomile she had been sealing for the week's deliveries. It was not yet noon, far too early for Thomas to be returning from his lessons, and she had learned over the past 3 days to dread any unexpected sound, certain each one carried news she was not prepared to hear. She opened the door to find Mr. Pratt, the estate solicitor, standing stiffly on her step, a leather folder clutched under one arm, and an expression of practiced neutrality on his narrow face. Behind him, at a careful distance, stood 2 men she did not recognize, watching the cottage with an unsettling intensity that made her skin prickle with unease. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mr. Pratt said, using the honorific title she had never actually earned, but had adopted years ago for the sake of simplicity and respectability. "I apologize for the intrusion. I have been sent to conduct a routine review of the estate's records, including the arrangements of those living upon Ravenswood land." Elena's grip tightened on the doorframe. "A routine review," she repeated carefully. How curious that such a review should arrive precisely 3 days after the Duke's return. Mr. Pratt did not meet her eyes directly, which told her everything she needed to know about who had truly sent him. The Duchess Beatrice Ashcombe requested certain matters be clarified before her own arrival, he admitted finally, his voice lowering slightly, as though the words themselves were shameful. "She wishes to understand the precise nature of your employment here, and the circumstances surrounding your son." The word son, spoken so clinically by a stranger standing on her doorstep, sent a cold spike of fear through Elena's chest. She had known this moment would come eventually, had braced herself for the Duchess's inevitable interference the very morning she learned Alexander had returned. Yet the reality of strangers arriving to catalogue her life and her son's existence, like items on an inventory list, left her shaking with barely contained anger. "My employment here has never once been in question," Elena said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "I have served as this estate's herbalist for 6 years, faithfully and without complaint, tending to every request made of me by this family. My son's existence is not a matter for review, Mr. Pratt. He is a child, not a line item in your ledgers." "I understand your distress," Mr. Pratt said, though his tone suggested he understood very little of it at all. "I am simply following instructions, Mrs. Whitmore. I have been asked to determine whether the child in question bears any legitimate claim upon the Ashcombe estate, and to prepare documentation accordingly before the Duchess arrives to address the matter personally." "And if I refuse to answer your questions?" Elena asked, her chin lifting with a defiance she did not entirely feel. "Then I am afraid the Duchess will draw her own conclusions when she arrives," Mr. Pratt said, not unkindly, though the implied threat was unmistakable. "Conclusions that may prove considerably less favorable to your position here than a cooperative conversation might allow." Elena felt the walls of her carefully built life pressing in around her. The same fear that had haunted her since Thomas's birth, now standing solid and undeniable at her very doorstep. She thought of Alexander's promise beside the stream, his insistence that he would handle his mother, and wondered bitterly whether he had any idea this was already happening, whether his mother's reach extended so quickly and so ruthlessly even before she had set foot on the estate. "I have nothing to hide, Mr. Pratt," Elena said finally, forcing calm into her voice. "But I will not discuss my son's parentage with strangers, standing uninvited at my door. If the Duchess wishes to know the truth, she may ask her own son directly, since he is the one who holds the answer she seeks." Mr. Pratt's composure flickered slightly at this response, clearly unprepared for such a direct redirection of the burden he had been assigned to carry. He made a few notes in his folder, thanked her stiffly for her time, and departed with his 2 silent companions, leaving Elena standing in her doorway, with her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She did not have long to collect herself before another visitor arrived, this one considerably more welcome, though his timing could not have been worse. Lord Harold Pembroke, a widowed gentleman who owned the neighboring estate and had courted Elena quietly for nearly a year, rode up the path with his usual easy smile, dismounting, before he had even fully noticed the tension still lingering in her expression. "Elena," he greeted warmly, then paused, as he took in her pale face and trembling hands. "What has happened? You look as though you have seen a ghost." "It is nothing, Harold," she said, though the lie sat poorly, even in her own mouth. "Simply matters concerning the estate." Harold's expression sharpened with concern, and he glanced briefly toward the manor, visible in the distance beyond the orchard, its gray stone walls seeming suddenly ominous rather than familiar. "This concerns the Duke's return, does it not?" he asked directly. "The whole village speaks of little else. They say a boy with the Duke's own eyes plays among the apple trees, and I confess I have wondered myself these past few days whether such rumors held any truth." Elena's stomach dropped. Harold had always been kind to her, patient in his courtship despite her repeated hesitations, and she had come to value his steady, undemanding presence in her life. But she had never told him the full truth of Thomas's parentage, allowing him instead to believe whatever quiet assumptions he had drawn on his own, and confronting that omission now, at the worst possible moment, felt like one more weight added to an already unbearable burden. "Thomas is my son," she said carefully. "That has never been a secret. Whatever else you have heard, I would ask that you allow me to explain it properly, rather than drawing conclusions from village gossip." "Then it is true," Harold said quietly, and something in his voice, some quiet disappointment he could not quite hide, told her he had already guessed the answer before she confirmed it. "The Duke is the boy's father." Elena did not answer immediately, and her silence was answer enough. Harold looked away, toward the orchard, his jaw working as he processed the information, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a careful, measured restraint that only made the hurt beneath it more apparent. "I had hoped, in time, that you might consider my proposal more seriously," he said. "I understood there was a father somewhere in Thomas's past, of course, but I had assumed him gone from your life entirely, a closed chapter, rather than a man now living in the very manor overlooking your cottage." "I did not plan for any of this, Harold," Elena said, guilt twisting sharply in her chest. "I have spent 5 years believing Alexander would never return, believing I had built a life here that no longer depended upon him in any way. His arrival has changed everything, and I am still trying to understand what it means, both for Thomas and for myself." "And what does it mean for us?" Harold asked, the question direct despite the gentleness in his tone. Elena struggled to find an honest answer, aware that whatever she said next would shape the remainder of their conversation, perhaps the remainder of their relationship entirely. "I do not know," she admitted finally. "I care for you, Harold, truly, but Thomas deserves the chance to know his father, and I cannot in good conscience deny him that, simply to protect my own comfort or certainty." Harold nodded slowly, accepting her honesty, even as it clearly cost him something to hear it. "I will not pressure you, Elena," he said. "But I will tell you plainly, the Duke's family has never been kind to those beneath their station. If his mother arrives intent on erasing Thomas from any claim upon this family, you may find yourself in need of an ally who will stand beside you regardless of what title he carries. I hope you will remember that I offered, whatever you decide." He mounted his horse and rode away without further argument, leaving Elena more unsettled than before his arrival. She stood in her doorway for a long while after he had gone, watching the empty path, weighing his warning against the fragile hope Alexander had planted in her only days earlier. That evening, once Thomas had fallen asleep, exhausted from another day of lessons and imaginary battles, Elena walked the familiar path toward the manor, needing to speak with Alexander directly, before matters spiraled further beyond her control. She found him in the stable yard, examining a young colt with Edward Blackwood, and the sight of him laughing easily at something Edward had said sent an unexpected pang through her chest, a reminder of simpler days long since past. "Elena," Alexander said, straightening immediately upon seeing her, concern evident in his expression. "Has something happened? Is Thomas well?" "Thomas is asleep, and perfectly well," Elena assured him quickly. "But your mother's solicitor visited my cottage today, Alexander, asking questions about my employment, and demanding to know whether Thomas holds any legitimate claim upon this family. Strangers stood upon my doorstep, discussing my son, as though he were a matter of accounting, rather than a living child." Alexander's expression darkened with anger, though Elena could see it was directed entirely at his mother, rather than at her. "She acted faster than even I expected," he said grimly. "I received her letter only yesterday morning, warning of her intended arrival within the fortnight. I did not imagine she would send Pratt ahead so swiftly." "She intends to erase him, Alexander," Elena said, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. "Not simply ignore him, but erase any claim he might have, any acknowledgement of who his father truly is." I cannot allow that. I have spent 5 years protecting Thomas from exactly this kind of cruelty, and I will not stand by quietly while your family attempts to reduce him to an inconvenient rumor. You will not stand alone, Alexander said firmly, stepping closer, his voice low and resolute. I do not care what my mother threatens, Elena. I acknowledged Thomas the moment I looked into his eyes in that orchard, and I will not retract that acknowledgement simply because it proves inconvenient for her plans. Edward, who had remained quietly by the colt stall throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Your mother has always been formidable, Alexander, but she has never faced true opposition from you before. If you intend to stand firm this time, you must be prepared for exactly how far she is willing to go to protect what she considers the family's interests. I am prepared, Alexander said, though the tightness in his jaw suggested he understood the difficulty of the battle ahead better than his words let on. I lost 5 years hiding from her disapproval, Elena. I will not lose Thomas as well. Elena studied him carefully in the fading evening light, searching for any hint of the hesitation that had driven him away once before, finding instead a steadiness she had not seen in him since their earliest days together, before duty and fear had complicated everything between them. It was not enough to erase 5 years of hurt entirely, but it was enough, for tonight at least, to let her believe that perhaps this time, he truly intended to stay and fight for what mattered most. The Duchess arrives within a fortnight, she said quietly. Whatever preparations you intend to make, Alexander, make them quickly. I do not believe she will announce her arrival with any warning beyond what she has already given, and I would rather face her on solid ground than be caught unprepared a second time. I will not let that happen, Alexander promised, though even as he spoke, a new thought had begun forming in his mind, one he had been circling since the moment Elena first mentioned the letters she never received. Once she had departed for her cottage, he turned back to Edward, his expression sharpening with sudden purpose. You said everyone on the estate suspected the truth about Thomas for years, Alexander said, which means my letters to Elena must have vanished somewhere between London and Ravenswood, long before they ever reached her hands. My mother would not have trusted such a delicate task to strangers. She would have used someone already within this household. Edward's expression grew cautious. You are asking me to name names, Alexander, based on suspicion alone. I am asking you to help me find the truth, Alexander corrected. If my mother intercepted those letters, there will be some record of it, some servant who handled the post during those years, and might remember more than they have ever admitted. Edward considered this for a long moment, then sighed, clearly weighing loyalty to the family against loyalty to his old friend. There was a footman named Cartwright who managed correspondence during those years, he said finally. He left the estate not long after you departed, moved to a position in your mother's London townhouse. If any letters were diverted, Cartwright would have been the one to do it, likely under direct instruction from the Duchess herself. Then I will write to him, Alexander said, already turning the possibility over in his mind. If I can prove my mother deliberately kept Elena and me apart, it may weaken whatever claims she intends to make once she arrives. And if you cannot prove it? Edward asked. Your mother is not a woman who leaves evidence of her own manipulations lying about for anyone to discover. She has spent 30 years managing this family's affairs, precisely because she never allows herself to be caught unprepared. Then I will simply have to be prepared myself, Alexander said grimly. Whatever proof exists, or does not exist, I will not allow her to dictate the terms of this conversation when she arrives. I have spent enough years allowing her decisions to shape my life without question. That ends now. Edward studied his friend for a long moment, something like quiet approval crossing his weathered face. It is good to see this resolve in you, Alexander. I confess I worried, these past 5 years, that the man who left Ravenswood had lost whatever backbone he once possessed. I very nearly did lose it, Alexander admitted quietly. But watching that boy in the orchard, watching him look up at me with such open trust, despite never having known me before that moment, I found something in myself I thought had disappeared entirely. I do not intend to lose it again. That night, Alexander sat at his father's old writing desk long after the household had gone quiet, composing a careful letter to the footman Cartwright, phrasing his questions delicately enough to avoid alarming a man who might otherwise refuse to answer honestly. He sealed the letter and arranged for it to be sent by the fastest post available, then sat back in his chair, staring at the dying embers of the fire, turning over every possible outcome in his mind. If Cartwright confirmed his suspicions, it would provide undeniable proof of his mother's interference, evidence he could use to counter whatever arguments she intended to bring against Elena and Thomas. If Cartwright denied any knowledge, or refused to respond at all, Alexander would be left with nothing but his own conviction, a conviction his mother would surely dismiss as the desperate imagination of a guilty man seeking to excuse his own absence. Either way, the fortnight ahead would demand more from him than he had given to anything in years. He thought of Thomas's bright, trusting gray eyes, of Elena's careful, hard-won composure, slowly softening in his presence, and found within himself a determination sharper than any he had felt since leaving Ravenswood 5 years earlier. Whatever his mother intended to bring with her when she arrived, Alexander resolved that he would meet it standing firmly on the side of his son, regardless of the cost to his own comfort, his own inheritance, or his own long-held fear of the woman who had shaped so much of his life, until this very moment. The fortnight would test him thoroughly, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt ready to be tested. The reply from Cartwright arrived 7 days later, delivered by a private courier rather than the usual estate post, and Alexander's hands shook slightly as he broke the seal, aware that whatever words waited inside could either strengthen his position considerably or leave him with nothing but suspicion to carry into the confrontation ahead. The letter was short, cautious in its phrasing, clearly written by a man still fearful of the family he had once served. Cartwright admitted, in careful and roundabout language, that he had indeed been instructed by the Duchess to intercept and destroy certain correspondence, addressed to a woman named Elena Whitmore, during the specific months following Alexander's departure. He claimed he had acted only out of obedience to his employer at the time, fearing for his position had he refused, and expressed quiet regret for whatever pain his actions had caused, though he stopped short of offering any formal statement that could be used publicly against the Duchess. Alexander read the letter 3 times, a strange mixture of vindication and fresh anger settling over him. He had suspected the truth, had felt it in his bones, the moment Elena mentioned letters that never arrived, yet seeing it confirmed in writing, however carefully worded, made the betrayal feel newly raw. His mother had not simply disapproved of his relationship with Elena, she had actively worked to destroy it, stealing away 5 years of his son's life through calculated silence. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the same drawer where he kept his father's old ledgers, deciding it was safer kept private for now, rather than risking its loss or destruction before he found the right moment to use it. He would need every advantage available to him when his mother arrived, and this letter, however incomplete, was the strongest weapon he currently possessed. That afternoon, as had become his custom over the past week, Alexander rode out to the orchard to spend time with Thomas, finding the boy this time perched on a low branch of one of the older apple trees, swinging his legs and calling out imaginary commands to an army of invisible soldiers positioned somewhere among the grass below. "General Ashcombe reporting for battle," Alexander called out, dismounting and offering a formal salute that made Thomas dissolve into delighted laughter. "You cannot be a general," Thomas informed him seriously, once his laughter had subsided. "I am the general. You may be my second in command, if you wish." "A great honor," Alexander said solemnly, settling onto the grass beneath the tree. "Though I confess I am somewhat unfamiliar with military strategy. Perhaps my general could instruct me." Thomas launched immediately into an elaborate explanation of his imaginary battle plans, gesturing enthusiastically, with hands that occasionally lost their grip on the branch above him, prompting Alexander to reach up more than once to steady the boy, before he tumbled from his perch entirely. It struck Alexander, watching his son's animated face, how easily happiness came to a child who had no knowledge yet of the complicated adult troubles swirling around him, and how desperately Alexander wanted to preserve that innocence for as long as possible. "Mama says a very important lady is coming to visit soon," Thomas mentioned casually, in the middle of describing his imaginary fortress. "She says I must be extra good and extra quiet when the lady arrives. Is she a queen?" Alexander's chest tightened at the question. "She is my mother," he said carefully, "which makes her your grandmother, though she does not yet know that." Thomas considered this information with the straightforward curiosity of a 5-year-old encountering a new and interesting fact. "Will she like me?" he asked, his voice suddenly small and uncertain, in a way that made Alexander's heart ache fiercely. "I do not know," Alexander answered honestly, unwilling to make promises he could not guarantee, though he immediately softened the admission, with reassurance he could offer truthfully. "But whatever she thinks, Thomas, I want you to know that I like you very much indeed, and nothing she says or does will ever change that." Thomas seemed satisfied with this answer, returning almost immediately to his imaginary battle strategy. But the question lingered uncomfortably in Alexander's mind, long after he had ridden back toward the manor that evening. His mother had never been a woman inclined toward warmth, even with her own son, and he found it difficult to imagine her extending any genuine affection toward a grandson born so far outside the boundaries of what she considered proper. He found Elena waiting near the stable yard when he returned, her expression troubled in a way that immediately put him on alert. "Thomas asked me about the visit today," Alexander said, before she could speak. "He asked whether my mother would like him." Elena's shoulders sagged slightly. "He has been asking me similar questions all week," she admitted. "Children sense far more than adults often give them credit for, Alexander. He knows something significant is approaching, even if he does not fully understand what it means. I told him I like him very much, regardless of what my mother thinks," Alexander said. "I hope that was the right thing to say." "It was exactly right," Elena said softly, and for a moment, something like genuine warmth passed between them, a brief reminder of the easy affection they had once shared, before duty and distance had complicated everything. "Thank you for that, Alexander." They walked together toward the orchard's edge, falling into an easy silence that felt different from the tension that had characterized their earlier conversations, something closer to the comfortable understanding they had once shared as younger people, before the world had grown so complicated around them. "I received a letter today," Alexander said finally, breaking the silence, "from a footman who once managed correspondence at Ravenswood. He confirmed what we already suspected, Elena. My mother intercepted the letters I sent you. She destroyed them deliberately, ensuring neither of us ever learned the truth of what the other believed." Elena stopped walking, her face pale in the fading afternoon light. "You have proof of this?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "A letter, admitting to it in careful terms," Alexander confirmed. "It may not satisfy a court of law, but it satisfies me entirely. I did not abandon you willingly, Elena. Whatever choices I made in weakness, after believing you had moved on without me, the fault for our years apart lies squarely with my mother's manipulation, not with any lack of love on my part." Elena's eyes filled with tears she had clearly been holding back for years, tears that seemed to carry the full weight of everything she had endured, believing herself abandoned and forgotten. "I spent so many nights convincing myself you simply did not care enough to fight for us," she said, her voice breaking. "Believing that love, if it was ever truly love at all, had not been strong enough to withstand your family's disapproval." "It was strong enough," Alexander said fiercely, closing the distance between them without conscious thought. "It has always been strong enough, Elena. I was simply too foolish, and too afraid to recognize it clearly enough at the time, to fight properly for what mattered most." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of 5 lost years settling between them, alongside something new and fragile, a tentative possibility neither had allowed themselves to consider since Alexander's return. Elena wiped at her eyes, composing herself with visible effort. "This changes things," she said finally. "If your mother learns you possess proof of her interference, she will not simply accept defeat quietly. She will fight harder, Alexander, and she will likely target me directly, rather than allowing the matter to remain focused solely on you." "I will not let her harm you," Alexander said firmly, "or Thomas. Whatever she attempts, I intend to stand fully between my mother and the both of you, regardless of what it costs me." "You say that now," Elena said, though there was less doubt in her voice than there might have been a week earlier. "But your mother has spent 30 years accustomed to getting exactly what she wants. I have seen grown men far more powerful than either of us bend entirely to her will within minutes of facing her directly. Then she will simply have to grow accustomed to disappointment," Alexander said, "because I do not intend to bend this time, no matter how forcefully she pushes." Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of the wavering resolve that had once driven him away, finding instead something steadier, something that had clearly grown stronger with each passing day spent in Thomas's presence. She allowed herself, cautiously, to believe that perhaps this time his conviction would truly hold against whatever tested it. As they walked back toward the cottage, the conversation shifted to lighter matters: Thomas's progress with his lessons, the small improvements Elena had made to her garden that spring, the gentle rhythms of ordinary life that continued regardless of the larger drama unfolding around them. It was in these quiet moments, Alexander realized, that he felt most himself, more at peace than he had felt in years living far from Ravenswood, surrounded by strangers who knew nothing of the life he had left behind. That night, after returning to the manor, Alexander received a second letter, this one far less welcome than Cartwright's careful admission. It came from his mother directly, her handwriting even sharper and more hurried than usual, informing him that her arrival had been moved forward considerably. She would reach Ravenswood in 3 days, rather than the fortnight originally promised, having grown, in her own words, increasingly concerned that delay would only allow further complications to take root. Alexander stared at the letter for a long time after reading it, the fragile sense of preparation he had begun building over the past week, suddenly feeling woefully insufficient against the compressed timeline now facing him. 3 days remained before his mother arrived, 3 days to prepare Elena, to prepare Thomas, to prepare himself, for a confrontation he suspected would test every relationship he had built since returning to Ravenswood. He sent word to Elena immediately, unwilling to let her learn such critical news from anyone but himself, and within the hour, she arrived at the manor's side entrance, having left Thomas asleep under the watchful care of a trusted neighbor. She found Alexander still pacing his study, the fire burned low and forgotten, his mother's letter lying open on the desk where he had read it a dozen times, searching for some hidden reassurance that was simply not there. 3 days, Elena said, reading the letter herself once he handed it to her. She has given us almost no time at all. I do not believe that is an accident, Alexander said grimly. My mother has always understood that pressure applied swiftly leaves less room for careful preparation. She wants us unbalanced when she arrives, uncertain of our footing. Elena set the letter down carefully, her expression tightening with the same fierce protectiveness Alexander had come to recognize whenever the conversation turned toward Thomas's future. Then we must not allow ourselves to be unbalanced, she said firmly. Whatever she intends, Alexander, we know the truth now. We have Cartwright's letter. We have each other's word. That is more than we possessed a fortnight ago. It may not be enough, Alexander admitted quietly. My mother has spent her entire life ensuring she always holds more power than anyone standing against her. I do not know what arguments she intends to bring, but I suspect they will not be limited simply to questions of parentage. What do you mean? Elena asked, a new wariness entering her voice. Alexander hesitated, reluctant to voice a fear that had been growing steadily since receiving the second letter. My mother controls a considerable portion of the family's remaining fortune, independently of the title itself, inherited through her own family before her marriage to my father, he said carefully. She has used that leverage before to influence decisions within this household, and I suspect she may threaten to withhold it now, or worse, threaten your position here directly, in an effort to force compliance. Elena's face paled slightly, though her resolve did not waver. She cannot simply dismiss me from a position I have held faithfully for 6 years without cause, she said, though the uncertainty in her voice suggested she was not entirely convinced of this herself. She will find cause if she needs to, Alexander said grimly. That is precisely the kind of woman she has always been. I do not say this to frighten you, Elena, but to prepare you. Whatever she brings against us in 3 days, we must be ready to meet it with more than simply good intentions. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying fire, her mind clearly working through the implications of everything Alexander had described. Then we must gather our own strength before she arrives, she said finally. You have Cartwright's letter. Perhaps there are others within this household who witnessed her interference, and might be willing to speak, now that you have returned, and shown yourself willing to stand against her. Edward may know of others, Alexander said, considering the possibility. And Mrs. Dunmore has served this family longer than almost anyone else remaining on the estate. If my mother's influence over the household staff has weakened at all during my absence, Mrs. Dunmore would know it better than most. They spent the remainder of that evening drafting a careful plan together, deciding who among the household might be approached discreetly for support, which arguments would carry the most weight against the Duchess's expected objections, and how best to present Thomas to his grandmother, in a manner that emphasized his innocence and worth, rather than the scandal of his birth. It was well past midnight before Elena finally rose to return to her cottage, exhaustion evident in the lines of her face, though something steadier had settled over her as well, a resolve that matched the determination Alexander had been building within himself. 3 days, she said again, standing at the study door, and then we shall know exactly what kind of woman we are truly facing. Whatever she brings, Alexander said, walking her to the door himself, despite the lateness of the hour. I promise you, Elena, I will not waver this time. I have already lost 5 years, standing on the wrong side of my own fear. I do not intend to lose a single day more. Elena studied his face carefully in the dim candlelight of the entrance hall, searching for any trace of the uncertainty that had once driven him from her side, finding instead a steadiness that seemed to have grown deeper with every day spent in Thomas's company. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of shared purpose, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the manor's doors, leaving Alexander alone with the weight of the days ahead pressing heavily upon his shoulders. He returned to his study and sat once more before the dying fire, staring at Cartwright's letter until the words blurred before his tired eyes. 3 days remained before his mother's carriage would appear at the gates of Ravenswood. 3 days to gather whatever strength and evidence he could muster. 3 days to prepare Thomas for a meeting that could shape the entire course of the boy's future. Whatever happened when the Duchess Beatrice Ashcombe finally arrived, Alexander understood with growing certainty that the outcome would depend not simply on evidence or arguments, but on his own willingness to finally stand firm against the woman who had shaped so much of his life through fear and obedience. He extinguished the last candle in his study and made his way to bed, knowing that sleep would come slowly if at all, his mind already racing ahead to the confrontation that awaited them all. The carriage bearing the Ashcombe family crest appeared at the gates of Ravenswood precisely at midday, 3 days after the Duchess's letter had promised. Exactly as Alexander expected of a woman who valued precision above almost every other virtue. He stood on the front steps of the manor, Elena beside him and Thomas holding tightly to her hand, all three of them, watching the carriage roll up the long gravel drive, with a growing sense of inevitability that made the summer air feel suddenly heavy and still. Thomas, sensing the tension radiating from the adults around him despite his young age, pressed closer to Elena's side, his usual boundless energy subdued into a wary quiet. "Is that the important lady?" he whispered. "Yes," Elena answered softly, squeezing his small hand reassuringly. "Remember what we discussed, Thomas. Be polite, be yourself, and everything will be perfectly fine." The carriage came to a stop, and a footman hurried forward to open the door. The Duchess Beatrice Ashcombe emerged with the same commanding presence she had carried her entire life, dressed in dark traveling clothes that somehow managed to appear both practical and imperious at once, her silver hair pinned severely beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her sharp eyes swept across the 3 figures waiting on the steps, lingering only a moment longer than necessary on the small boy standing beside Elena before settling on her son. "Alexander," she said, her voice carrying the particular coldness she reserved for moments of deep displeasure. "I see the rumors that reached me in London were not exaggerated in the slightest." "Mother," Alexander replied, descending the steps to greet her properly, though his posture remained rigid with barely restrained tension. "Welcome back to Ravenswood. I trust your journey was comfortable." "My journey was considerably less comfortable than the news that prompted it," the Duchess replied sharply, brushing past his greeting entirely. Her gaze returned to Thomas, studying him with an expression Alexander could not quite read, something between calculation and grudging recognition. "This is the child, I presume." "This is Thomas," Alexander said firmly, stepping slightly to place himself beside the boy, rather than allowing his mother's scrutiny to stand unanswered. "My son." The Duchess's expression flickered almost imperceptibly at the direct acknowledgement, rather from surprise at his boldness or simple distaste. Alexander could not immediately determine. "We shall discuss the matter of your claims regarding this child inside," she said, her eyes moving briefly to Elena, before dismissing her entirely, addressing only her son. "Privately, I should think, rather than airing family matters upon the front steps for every servant to witness." "Elena will be present for any discussion regarding Thomas," Alexander said firmly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "She is his mother, and this conversation concerns her son's future as much as it concerns mine." The Duchess's eyebrows rose slightly at this open defiance, a small crack appearing in her otherwise unshakable composure. "Very well," she said finally, her tone suggesting she considered this merely a temporary concession, rather than a true acceptance of Elena's place in the conversation. "Though I hardly see what an herbalist's daughter has to contribute to a discussion of family inheritance." Elena's spine straightened at the deliberate insult, but she said nothing, allowing Alexander to lead the way into the manor's formal drawing room, where a fire had already been lit despite the summer warmth, likely at Mrs. Dunmore's careful anticipation of the Duchess's preference for a properly heated room, regardless of the season. Thomas was sent, with gentle reassurance from both his parents, to wait in the kitchen with Mrs. Dunmore, who had promised him fresh bread and honey to ease the waiting. Once the drawing-room door had closed behind them, the Duchess settled into the largest chair by the fire, with the unhurried confidence of a woman entirely accustomed to controlling every room she entered. "Let us dispense with unnecessary pleasantries," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "I understand you believe this child to be your son, Alexander. I understand also that you intend, foolishly in my estimation, to acknowledge him publicly, and perhaps even legitimize his position within this family." "He is my son," Alexander said simply. "There is no believing involved. I have seen the truth of it with my own eyes, and I do not intend to deny him any longer." "Resemblance alone proves nothing definitively," the Duchess said dismissively. "Many children share coloring with families they hold no true blood connection to. I will not have this family's name and fortune thrown carelessly toward every child born to a woman who once found favor with you." "I did not simply find favor with Elena," Alexander said, his voice hardening. "I loved her, mother, and I would have married her 5 years ago, had you not driven me away with threats of disinheritance and disgrace. Thomas exists because of a love you deliberately destroyed, and I will not allow you to erase him from this family's history, as though he were merely an inconvenient accident." The Duchess's expression tightened, though she remained otherwise composed. "You speak as though I am solely responsible for choices you made yourself, Alexander. I did not force you onto that ship 5 years ago. You chose to leave." "I chose to leave because you convinced me it was the only way to protect Elena from your cruelty," Alexander said. "And because you ensured every letter I sent afterward, every attempt to reach her and explain myself, never reached its intended destination." For the first time since her arrival, the Duchess's composure faltered slightly, a flicker of something like alarm crossing her sharp features before she smoothed it away again. "I do not know what you mean," she said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Alexander reached into his coat and withdrew Cartwright's letter, unfolding it slowly and holding it out toward his mother. "Cartwright remembers quite clearly, mother. He has confirmed, in writing, that you instructed him to intercept and destroy correspondence between myself and Elena during the months following my departure. I have his letter here, should you wish to read his own words rather than rely solely upon mine." The Duchess did not reach for the letter, though her eyes remained fixed upon it for a long, tense moment. "Whatever measures I took," she said finally, her voice regaining some of its former sharpness, "I took to protect this family's standing, and this family's future. A duke cannot simply marry an herbalist's daughter without consequence, Alexander. The scandal alone would have followed us for generations. And yet here we stand," Elena said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the room, her voice steady despite the fear Alexander knew she must be feeling. "5 years later, with the scandal you sought to avoid, now arriving regardless, only compounded by 5 additional years of pain that need never have existed at all, had you simply allowed 2 people who loved each other to remain together." The Duchess's gaze snapped toward Elena, cold and assessing. "You dare speak to me directly of what this family should or should not have allowed," she said, though there was less certainty in her tone than there might once have been. "I dare speak, because my son deserves better than to be discussed, as though he were not present in this house at all," Elena replied, her voice rising slightly, with a passion she had clearly been holding carefully in check. "He is a bright, kind, wonderful child, Your Grace, regardless of the circumstances of his birth, and I will not stand quietly while you decide his worth based solely upon considerations of scandal and inheritance." A tense silence followed her words, the fire crackling loudly in the sudden quiet. The Duchess studied Elena for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind her sharp eyes, before she finally spoke again, her tone measured and deliberate. "Very well," she said. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that this child truly is Alexander's son. What precisely do you imagine happens next? Do you expect me to simply welcome him as heir to this family's title, despite being born entirely outside the bounds of marriage? Do you understand the legal and social complications such a decision would invite? I expect you to acknowledge the truth, Alexander said. Whatever legal arrangements must follow, I intend to marry Elena and legitimize Thomas as my son and rightful heir. I did not return to Ravenswood merely to visit, Mother. I returned to build the life I should have built 5 years ago, before your interference stole it from me. The Duchess's face hardened at this declaration, and Alexander could see her calculating rapidly behind her composed expression, weighing arguments and threats that had likely worked flawlessly on countless occasions throughout her long life of commanding obedience from those around her. You understand, she said slowly, that such a marriage would raise considerable questions among our peers, questions that could damage this family's reputation for a generation or more. I have worked tirelessly to maintain our standing since your father's passing, Alexander. I will not watch you undo that work through sentiment alone. Then perhaps our standing was never as solid as you believed, Alexander replied. If it depends entirely upon hiding the truth of my son's existence rather than embracing it honestly. The Duchess rose from her chair abruptly, moving toward the window that overlooked the front drive, her back rigid with barely contained frustration. I will need time to consider this matter further, she said finally, without turning to face them. This is not a decision to be made hastily, based solely upon a single letter and your own conviction, however sincere it may be. Take whatever time you need, Mother, Alexander said. But understand clearly, my decision is already made. I intend to marry Elena and acknowledge Thomas as my son, regardless of whatever conclusion you reach in your own deliberations. The Duchess turned back to face them, her expression unreadable, and for a long moment, the three of them simply regarded one another across the tension-filled room, the fire's warmth doing little to soften the cold uncertainty that had settled over all of them. I should like to see the boy before I retire to rest from my journey, she said finally, her tone giving away nothing of her true intentions. Properly, rather than glimpsing him briefly upon the front steps. Alexander exchanged a quick glance with Elena, uncertain what to make of this sudden request, though refusing seemed unwise, given how carefully they needed to navigate every moment of this delicate negotiation. Of course, he said, I will bring him in myself. He found Thomas in the kitchen exactly where they had left him, seated at the large wooden table with honey smeared across his fingers, and a look of pure contentment on his face, as Mrs. Dunmore fussed over him with the easy affection of a woman who had clearly grown fond of the boy over the past week. Thomas looked up eagerly as Alexander entered, his earlier nervousness apparently forgotten in the face of fresh bread and honey. Is it time to meet the lady? Thomas asked, wiping his sticky fingers hastily on a cloth Mrs. Dunmore provided. It is, Alexander said, crouching down to look his son directly in the eyes. Remember, Thomas, whatever she says, whatever expression she wears, I want you to simply be yourself. That is more than enough. Thomas nodded solemnly, taking Alexander's hand as they walked back toward the drawing room, and Elena rose from her seat as they entered, positioning herself protectively near her son, even as she allowed him to approach his grandmother directly. The Duchess remained seated, studying the boy with an expression Alexander still could not quite decipher, something guarded and assessing that gave away none of her true feelings. Good afternoon, Thomas said politely, remembering the manners Elena had drilled into him carefully over the previous days. I am Thomas. I am aware of who you are, the Duchess replied, though not unkindly, her sharp eyes moving over his features with an intensity that made Alexander distinctly uncomfortable, though he forced himself to remain still and allow the encounter to unfold naturally. Papa says you are my grandmother, Thomas continued, undeterred by her cool tone, his natural curiosity overriding whatever nervousness he might have felt. Do you like apples? We have a whole orchard of them. I could show you my kingdom, if you like. Something flickered across the Duchess's stern face, so brief that Alexander nearly missed it entirely, a softening around her eyes that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Your kingdom, she repeated, a note of genuine curiosity entering her otherwise controlled voice. I am the bravest knight in all of Ravenswood, Thomas explained proudly, his chest puffing out in the exact manner Alexander had witnessed that very first evening in the orchard. I defend the apple trees from dragons and invaders. Papa helped me fight off 3 dragons just yesterday." The Duchess's gaze flicked briefly to Alexander at the word Papa, something unreadable crossing her expression, before returning to the boy standing earnestly before her. "And who taught you to speak of dragons and kingdoms with such confidence?" she asked. "Mrs. Fairweather reads us stories at the schoolhouse," Thomas explained. "And Mama tells me stories every night before bed. My favorite is about a knight who saves a whole village from a terrible storm." "Does she indeed?" the Duchess murmured, her eyes moving briefly toward Elena, something in her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. Though whether toward reluctant respect or continued suspicion, Alexander could not determine. The conversation continued for several more minutes, Thomas chattering happily about his imaginary battles and his collection of skipping stones, entirely unaware of the weight his grandmother's assessment carried for his future. The Duchess asked occasional questions, her tone gradually losing some of its earlier coldness, though she remained far too composed a woman to reveal any true softening of her position on the larger matters at hand. Finally, she raised a hand, gently indicating the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "You may return to your bread and honey," she said to Thomas, not unkindly. "I believe Mrs. Dunmore promised you a second slice, if I recall her words correctly." Thomas beamed and bowed with exaggerated formality, before scampering from the room, leaving the 3 adults once more alone, with the tension that had briefly softened in the boy's innocent presence. "He is a remarkably well-mannered child," the Duchess said finally, once the door had closed behind him, "for a boy raised without benefit of proper family guidance." "He has been raised with considerable love and attention, Your Grace," Elena said evenly, "which I have always believed matters far more than proper family guidance alone." The Duchess did not respond directly to this, rising instead from her chair and moving toward the door. "I have had a long journey," she said, "and I require rest before continuing this conversation further. We shall speak again tomorrow, once I have had adequate time to consider everything discussed this afternoon." She departed without further comment, leaving Alexander and Elena alone in the drawing room, both of them releasing breaths they had clearly been holding throughout the entire tense encounter. "That went better than I expected," Elena admitted quietly, once they were certain the Duchess was well out of earshot. "Do not mistake her silence for surrender," Alexander cautioned, though he too had noticed the brief softening in his mother's expression, while Thomas spoke of his imaginary kingdom. "My mother rarely reveals her true intentions until she has fully decided her course of action. Tomorrow's conversation may prove considerably more difficult than today's." "He charmed her, whether she wishes to admit it or not," Elena said, a small, cautious smile finally breaking through her earlier tension. "I saw it in her eyes, Alexander, even if she fought hard to hide it." "Perhaps," Alexander allowed, though a familiar wariness remained lodged firmly in his chest. "But charm alone will not be enough to overcome 30 years of rigid tradition and pride. We must remain prepared for whatever she decides to bring against us tomorrow, regardless of how today's meeting unfolded." They stood together for a long moment in the fading afternoon light, the weight of the day's confrontation settling slowly over both of them, mixed with a fragile thread of hope neither had quite expected to feel by evening's end. Whatever tomorrow brought, this first encounter had at least proven one thing clearly. The Duchess Beatrice Ashcombe, for all her formidable coldness, had not been entirely immune to the simple, unguarded warmth of a child who knew nothing yet of the battles being fought on his behalf. Elena was summoned to the manor before breakfast the following morning, the request delivered through a stone-faced maid who offered no explanation beyond the Duchess's wish to speak with her privately, without Alexander present. Elena's stomach twisted with unease as she made the familiar walk from her cottage, leaving Thomas in the care of a neighbor and trying to steady her nerves against whatever awaited her behind the manor's imposing doors. She was shown into a small sitting room rather than the formal drawing room from the previous day, a space clearly chosen for its intimacy, and found the Duchess already seated near the window, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her, her posture radiating the same commanding authority Elena had witnessed the day before. "Thank you for coming so promptly," the Duchess said, gesturing toward the chair opposite her own, without any warmth in the invitation. "I thought it best we speak alone, woman to woman, without my son's presence complicating matters unnecessarily." Elena took the offered seat cautiously, folding her hands in her lap to still their trembling. I am listening, Your Grace. I have given considerable thought to yesterday's conversation, the Duchess began, her tone measured and deliberate. And I have concluded that a certain arrangement might serve everyone's interests far better than the path my son currently insists upon pursuing. What manner of arrangement? Elena asked warily. The Duchess reached into a small leather case resting beside her chair and withdrew a folded document, sliding it across the table toward Elena without further preamble. A generous sum, she said, sufficient to establish yourself and your son comfortably in a location of your choosing, far from Ravenswood, far from the complications my son's foolish sentiment would otherwise create for all of us. Enough to ensure Thomas receives a proper education, a respectable position in whatever profession suits him best as he grows, all without the burden of scandal that would inevitably follow any attempt to legitimize his claim upon this family. Elena stared at the document without touching it, understanding immediately the full weight of what the Duchess was proposing. You wish to pay me to disappear, she said quietly, and to take my son away from his father entirely. I wish to spare everyone involved considerable pain and public embarrassment, the Duchess corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless to Elena's ears. Alexander is young and driven by sentiment that will fade in time, as such feelings inevitably do. You, however, strike me as a woman of practical sense, someone who understands the realities of the world far better than my son's current romantic notions allow him to see clearly. You are mistaken if you believe my sense of practicality extends to selling my son's relationship with his father, Elena said, her voice hardening despite the fear still churning in her chest. I will not now deny him the chance to have a father simply because it proves inconvenient for your family's reputation. The Duchess's expression tightened slightly, though she pressed forward with the same calm determination she had clearly planned for this conversation. Consider carefully what you are choosing, Mrs. Whitmore, she said. If you refuse this offer, I promise you, the road ahead will not be easy. I have considerable influence in matters far beyond this estate. Your position here could become untenable, should I decide it necessary. Positions in respectable households do not come easily to women in your circumstances, particularly once certain unflattering details of your history become more widely known than they currently are. Are you threatening me, Your Grace? Elena asked directly, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her effort at composure. I am simply explaining the realities you face, the Duchess replied, though the threat beneath her measured words was unmistakable. Alexander's affection for you and the boy is genuine. I do not doubt that. But affection alone cannot protect you from the practical consequences of standing against a family with the resources and influence mine possesses. I have spent 30 years ensuring this family's standing remains unassailable. I will not allow a moment of my son's misplaced sentiment to undo decades of careful work. Elena sat in tense silence for a long moment, her mind racing through every possible response, every consequence of accepting or refusing what the Duchess had offered. She thought of Thomas's bright, trusting face, of the joy he had shown playing with his father in the orchard, of the wooden sword he had proudly displayed to Alexander that first evening. She thought too of the 5 years already lost to the Duchess's earlier manipulations, and the fresh anger that thought stirred within her steadied her resolve considerably. I will not take your money, Your Grace, Elena said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. Not because I lack practical sense, as you suggest, but because I understand exactly what such an arrangement would cost my son. He would grow up wondering why his father never came for him, believing perhaps that he was never wanted at all. I will not inflict that particular wound upon him, simply to spare your family some temporary embarrassment. The Duchess's composure flickered, clearly unaccustomed to such direct refusal from anyone, let alone a woman she had expected to bend easily beneath the weight of financial pressure. You understand, she said slowly, that I could make your continued presence at Ravenswood considerably more difficult, regardless of your refusal today. I understand that you could try, Elena replied, rising from her chair with a dignity she had not felt fully certain of only moments earlier. But I have survived 5 years of difficulty already, Your Grace, raising my son, alone, without benefit of your family's resources or protection. I do not believe, whatever further difficulty you introduce now, will prove any harder to endure than what I have already overcome. She turned to leave, her heart pounding fiercely, despite the outward calm she had managed to project. But the Duchess's voice stopped her at the door. You love him, the Duchess said, and something in her tone had shifted, no longer purely calculating, but touched with something almost like genuine curiosity. "My son, despite everything he put you through, despite the years of silence and hardship, you still love him." Elena turned back slowly, surprised by the sudden change in the conversation's direction. "I do," she admitted, seeing little reason to deny something so plainly evident. "Though love alone was never the question here, Your Grace. My son's welfare has always mattered to me far more than my own feelings toward his father." The Duchess studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her sharp eyes. "My own marriage was arranged for practical considerations alone," she said finally, her voice quieter than Elena had yet heard it. "Alexander's father and I built a respectable partnership, certainly, built on mutual understanding and shared duty toward this family's legacy. But I confess, I never knew the particular foolishness of love you describe so plainly." Elena was uncertain how to respond to this unexpected admission, sensing some deeper vulnerability beneath the Duchess's formidable exterior that she had not anticipated encountering. "Perhaps that is precisely why you find it so difficult to understand why Alexander refuses to abandon what he has found here," she said carefully. The Duchess's expression hardened once more. Whatever brief vulnerability had surfaced, now carefully sealed away again behind her usual composed authority. "Perhaps," she allowed, though her tone made clear the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "You may go, Mrs. Whitmore. I have considerable thinking still to do before I decide how best to proceed." Elena departed the manor with her mind racing, uncertain whether the conversation represented progress or simply a temporary retreat before the Duchess launched a more forceful attack. She found Alexander waiting anxiously near the stables, having clearly learned of his mother's private summons and grown increasingly worried in Elena's absence. "What did she say to you?" he demanded the moment she came within earshot. Elena recounted the conversation carefully, watching Alexander's expression darken with each detail, his hands clenching into fists at his sides as she described his mother's offer of money and her thinly veiled threats regarding Elena's position. "She had no right," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "I will speak with her immediately. This ends now, Elena. I will not have her threatening you or attempting to buy you off as though you were a problem to be solved with sufficient coin." "Wait," Elena said, catching his arm before he could stride off toward the manor in his fury. "There is something else, Alexander. Something shifted near the end of our conversation. She asked whether I truly loved you, and when I confirmed it, she spoke, briefly, of her own marriage. I believe, beneath everything else, your mother may understand far less about genuine affection than either of us realized. Perhaps that ignorance is driving her actions as much as any true malice." Alexander's anger softened slightly at this observation, though it did not entirely dissipate. "That may explain her behavior," he said, "but it does not excuse it. Whatever uncertainty she carries about love herself, she has no right to threaten you or attempt to purchase your silence regarding our son." "I refused her offer," Elena said firmly. "Whatever comes next, Alexander, know that I will not be bought or frightened away from Thomas's future with his father. Whatever battle remains ahead of us, I intend to face it standing beside you, not running from it." Alexander pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace, something they had not shared since his return. 5 years of separation and hurt, finally beginning to soften into something resembling the trust they had once shared so easily. "Thank you," he said quietly into her hair, "for staying, for fighting. I do not deserve such loyalty after everything I failed to do for you and Thomas these past years, but I am endlessly grateful for it regardless." "We are fighting for our son," Elena said simply, pulling back slightly to meet his eyes. "That is reason enough for either of us to stand firm, regardless of what either of us may or may not deserve." They stood together for a long moment in the quiet morning light, gathering their strength for whatever the Duchess intended to attempt next, both of them aware that her retreat this morning likely represented only a temporary pause before a more determined effort to separate them once and for all. Alexander insisted, despite Elena's gentle attempt to dissuade him, that he speak with his mother directly before the day grew any older, unwilling to allow her attempted bribery to pass without proper confrontation. He found her still in the small sitting room, the untouched tea now cold beside her, staring out at the orchard visible through the window with an expression he could not quite read. She did not turn immediately when he entered, though she clearly recognized his footsteps. I hear you attempted to purchase Elena's silence this morning, Alexander said, closing the door firmly behind him, and that when she refused, you threatened her position here at Ravenswood. I offered her a practical solution to an impractical problem, the Duchess replied, still gazing out the window. One she was foolish enough to refuse. She refused because she loves me, Mother, and because she understands what Thomas would lose if she accepted your money and disappeared, Alexander said, moving further into the room. I would think, of all people, you might understand loyalty of that particular kind, given how fiercely you have always defended this family's name and legacy. The Duchess finally turned to face him, something weary settling into the lines around her eyes that Alexander had not noticed the previous day, hidden perhaps beneath her carefully maintained composure. You believe I do not understand loyalty, she said. You are mistaken, Alexander. Everything I have done since your father's passing, every decision I have made regarding this family's fortune and reputation, has been in service of loyalty to what your father built, to what generations before him built as well. I simply understand loyalty differently than you appear to. Loyalty to a name and a title means nothing if it comes at the cost of a child's happiness, Alexander said. Thomas is your grandson, Mother. Whatever circumstances surround his birth, he did not choose them, and he deserves better than to be treated as a problem requiring a practical solution. And what would you have me do instead? The Duchess asked, a flash of genuine frustration finally breaking through her composure. Simply accept a scandal that will follow this family for generations? Watch our standing among our peers crumble because you insist upon marrying beneath your station out of sentiment alone? I would have you accept that your son is happy for the first time in 5 years, Alexander said, his voice softening slightly despite his earlier anger. I would have you see, as I have come to see clearly these past 2 weeks, that Elena and Thomas are not problems to be solved, but the family I should have built long ago, before your interference and my own cowardice stole those years from all of us. The Duchess was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting back toward the window, toward the orchard beyond where her grandson had likely resumed his imaginary battles against invisible dragons. I lost your father 18 months ago, she said finally, her voice quieter than Alexander had ever heard it. Since then, I have carried this family's entire weight upon my own shoulders, certain that any weakness, any deviation from proper tradition, would bring the whole structure crashing down around us. Perhaps I have grown too rigid in that certainty. Perhaps I no longer see clearly what truly threatens this family's future, and what merely threatens my own understanding of how things ought to be. Then reconsider, Alexander said, hearing something shift in his mother's tone that gave him a flicker of cautious hope. Give Elena and Thomas a genuine chance, Mother, rather than treating them as obstacles to be removed through money or threats. I am not asking you to abandon everything you believe in overnight. I am simply asking you to watch, to observe, before you decide their fate so completely. The Duchess did not answer immediately, her expression carefully guarded once more, though something in her posture suggested his words had landed with more weight than she was willing to openly admit. I will consider what you have said, she replied finally, but understand, Alexander, I make no promises regarding the outcome of that consideration. It was, Alexander realized as he left the sitting room, the closest thing to genuine reflection he had witnessed from his mother, in longer than he could remember, and though it offered no guarantee of the outcome he desperately hoped for, it felt, cautiously, like a small crack forming in the formidable wall she had built around herself over decades of rigid duty and control. That afternoon, as though fate itself had chosen to intervene at precisely the right moment, Thomas came racing across the lawn toward the manor, breathless with excitement over a nest of baby birds he had discovered near the old stone wall bordering the orchard. He nearly collided with the Duchess, who had ventured outside for a brief walk, despite her earlier claim of needing rest. And rather than scolding the boy for his carelessness, she found herself listening, almost against her own will, as he described the tiny featherless chicks in exhaustive and enthusiastic detail. Would you like to see them? Thomas asked, entirely unaware of the delicate negotiations his existence had prompted that very morning. You have to be very quiet, or the mother bird gets frightened away. The Duchess hesitated only a moment before following him toward the stone wall, and Alexander, watching from a distance near the stable yard, felt something loosen slightly in his chest at the sight of his formidable mother, crouching carefully beside his son, examining the small nest with an attention she rarely offered anyone or anything. Whatever calculations still churned behind her sharp eyes, Thomas's simple, unguarded joy seemed to be reaching some part of her that decades of duty and tradition had not entirely hardened beyond feeling. A carriage Elena did not recognize stood outside her cottage when she returned from the village market 3 days after the Duchess's uncomfortable proposal, and her stomach dropped immediately at the sight of Lord Harold Pembroke standing beside it, his expression unusually grave as he waited for her to approach. "Harold," she said, setting down her basket of purchases with growing unease, "I did not expect to see you today. I would not have come uninvited, Elena, except that I heard something troubling in the village this morning. Something I believed you ought to know before matters progress any further," Harold said, glancing briefly toward the manor, visible beyond the orchard. "There is talk that the Duchess has consulted with lawyers in the county town, seeking to understand what legal challenges might be raised against Thomas's legitimacy, should the Duke insist upon proceeding with any formal acknowledgement." Elena's blood ran cold at this news. "What manner of challenges?" she asked, her voice tight with sudden fear. "I do not know the particulars," Harold admitted, "only that her solicitor has been making inquiries regarding the legal standing of children born outside marriage, and what precedent exists for such children being formally excluded from inheritance, regardless of a father's wishes to acknowledge them. It seems the Duchess intends to explore every possible avenue before conceding the matter to her son's determination." Elena's mind raced through the implications of this news, understanding immediately that whatever fragile warmth had begun to develop between the Duchess and Thomas during their brief encounter by the bird's nest had apparently not been enough to soften her underlying resolve to prevent this outcome by any means available to her. "Thank you for telling me, Harold," she said finally, "though I confess I do not know what use to make of such information, beyond simply worrying more than I already have been. I tell you because I care what happens to you and Thomas, regardless of whatever decision you ultimately make about your own future," Harold said quietly. "I know I said I would not pressure you, Elena, and I intend to honor that promise, but I would be remiss if I did not warn you that a woman with the Duchess's resources, determined enough to consult lawyers before even settling her own initial impression of the boy, is not a woman likely to abandon her efforts easily." Elena thanked him again, watching as he departed with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout their entire brief acquaintance, before hurrying toward the manor to find Alexander and share this troubling development. She found him in his study, poring over a stack of estate documents with Edward Blackwood, both men looking up with immediate concern as she entered without knocking. "Elena, what has happened?" Alexander asked, rising quickly from his chair. She recounted Harold's warning as steadily as she could manage, watching Alexander's expression darken progressively with each detail, his jaw tightening in the same manner she had come to recognize whenever his mother's actions provoked genuine anger rather than mere frustration. "She promised to consider what I said to her," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "I believed, foolishly perhaps, that our conversation had shifted something within her, that Thomas's presence had begun softening whatever rigid opposition she had arrived with. Instead, she has apparently been quietly gathering ammunition to use against us the entire time." "Perhaps both things are true," Edward suggested carefully, his tone measured despite the tension in the room. "Your mother is not a woman easily moved from careful strategy, Alexander, even when her own feelings shift in unexpected directions. It is entirely possible she finds herself genuinely torn, caught between whatever growing affection Thomas has stirred in her and her lifelong instinct to protect this family through legal and practical means, rather than sentiment alone. That does not excuse consulting lawyers to strip my son of any legitimate claim upon his own inheritance," Alexander said sharply. "Whatever conflict she carries internally, her actions speak clearly enough regarding her true intentions." Elena moved to stand beside him, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "We knew this would not be easily won, Alexander," she said. "Whatever legal challenges she brings, we must simply meet them as prepared as we possibly can be. Perhaps it is time to consult our own solicitor, someone who can advise us clearly on what protections exist for Thomas regardless of whatever arguments the Duchess's lawyers construct against him." "I know just such a man," Edward offered, "a solicitor in the county town, entirely independent of the Ashcombe family's usual legal counsel, known for his fair and careful handling of matters concerning inheritance and legitimacy. I can arrange a meeting within the week, if you wish." Arrange it as quickly as possible, Alexander said. I will not be caught unprepared a second time by my mother's careful planning. That evening, Alexander sought out his mother once more, finding her in the manor's small library, a room she had always favored during her rare visits to Ravenswood. Surrounded by books she rarely had time to read, given her constant attention to matters of business and estate management. She looked up as he entered, something guarded immediately settling over her expression, as though she anticipated exactly the confrontation he had come to deliver. I have heard you have consulted lawyers regarding Thomas's legitimacy, Alexander said, without preamble, closing the library door firmly behind him. Despite everything we discussed only days ago, despite watching you kneel beside that bird's nest with him, as though something in your heart had genuinely softened toward the boy. The Duchess set down the book she had been holding, her expression carefully composed, though something flickered briefly behind her sharp eyes. I told you I would consider the matter carefully, she said. Careful consideration requires understanding every possible outcome, Alexander, including legal ones. I have not decided to actively pursue any challenge against the boy. I have simply sought to understand what options exist, should circumstances require such measures. And do circumstances require such measures? Alexander asked directly. Or do you simply find it easier to hedge your position with legal contingencies, rather than commit fully to the reconciliation I hoped our earlier conversation might have begun? The Duchess was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the book in her lap absently. I find myself in unfamiliar territory, Alexander, she admitted finally, her voice quieter than her usual commanding tone. For 30 years, I have known exactly how to protect this family, exactly what actions preserve our standing and our future. Watching that boy speak so earnestly of birds and imaginary kingdoms, I felt something I have not allowed myself to feel in longer than I can remember, and it frightened me considerably more than any legal complication ever could. Then why consult lawyers at all, if genuine feeling has begun to move you? Alexander pressed, though his tone had softened slightly at this unexpected admission. Because feeling alone has never been sufficient protection against the practical realities of the world we live in, the Duchess replied. I wish to understand precisely what risks we face, what challenges others among our peers might raise against Thomas's legitimacy, even if I myself choose not to pursue them. Knowledge, Alexander, not necessarily action. Though I understand how the distinction may have appeared considerably more threatening from your position. Alexander studied his mother carefully, uncertain whether to trust this explanation entirely, though something in her weary posture suggested genuine sincerity beneath her characteristically guarded words. I need more than careful consideration, Mother, he said finally. I need to know whether you intend to stand against us, or beside us. Because Elena and I cannot continue building a future for our son, while constantly bracing against the possibility of your opposition, undermining every step forward we manage to take. The Duchess rose slowly from her chair, moving toward the window that overlooked the darkening orchard beyond, her silhouette outlined against the fading evening light. Give me until the end of the week, she said finally, without turning to face him. I promise you a clear answer by then, Alexander, one way or the other. I owe you and that boy at least that much clarity, whatever my final decision proves to be. It was not the immediate reassurance Alexander had hoped for, but it was, he recognized, more honesty than his mother had offered since her arrival, and he found himself accepting the terms of her request, despite his earlier frustration. He left the library that evening, with cautious hope mingled uneasily with continued uncertainty, aware that whatever decision his mother reached by week's end would likely determine the entire course of his family's future, for better or for considerably worse. He returned to Elena that night to share this development, and though she listened carefully to every detail of his conversation with the Duchess, her expression remained guarded, unwilling to allow herself false comfort before the promised week had actually passed, and his mother's true decision revealed itself clearly. A week is not long, she said finally, but it is not nothing either. Perhaps it is enough time for whatever softening we witnessed by that bird's nest to grow into something more lasting, rather than fading back into her usual caution. I hope so, Alexander said quietly. For all our sakes, Elena, I hope so more than I have hoped for almost anything in these past 5 difficult years. They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them, both of them aware that the coming week would likely prove the most decisive period yet in the battle to secure Thomas's future, and both of them determined, regardless of whatever the Duchess ultimately decided, to face it together rather than allow fear to separate them a second time. 2 days into that fragile week of waiting, a shout of alarm shattered the quiet afternoon calm of the estate. Elena had left Thomas playing near the orchard's edge for only a few minutes while she gathered herbs from a patch near the stream, and when she turned back to check on him, the small figure that should have been swinging his wooden sword among the apple trees was nowhere to be seen. "Thomas," she called, her voice rising with immediate panic as she scanned the orchard in every direction. "Thomas, where are you?" Only silence answered her, broken by the gentle rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze. Elena's heart began pounding violently as she raced through the rows of trees, calling his name again and again, her mind flooding with every terrible possibility a mother's imagination could conjure. She reached the stream's edge, breathless with fear, and found only his abandoned collection of skipping stones scattered along the bank, no sign of the boy himself anywhere in sight. She ran toward the manor as fast as her legs could carry her, bursting into the stable yard where Alexander and Edward stood examining a saddle repair, both men startled by her sudden, frantic arrival. "Thomas is missing," she gasped out, barely able to catch her breath. "I left him only minutes near the orchard, and now I cannot find him anywhere. His stones are still by the stream, but he is not there." Alexander's face drained of color instantly, and within moments he had organized the household staff and stable hands into search parties, sending them fanning out across every corner of the estate, while he and Elena raced back toward the orchard themselves, calling Thomas's name with increasing desperation. They searched for nearly an hour, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, fear growing sharper with every empty corner of the estate they checked. Elena's mind raced through nightmare scenarios, wondering if he had wandered too close to the old stone quarry at the estate's edge, or ventured onto the main road where carriages sometimes passed at dangerous speeds. It was the Duchess, unexpectedly, who found him. She had been walking near the eastern boundary of the estate, an area rarely explored by the household given its distance from the manor, when she heard a small, frightened voice calling out from beneath a fallen log near an old badger's den Thomas had apparently discovered while chasing a rabbit into unfamiliar territory. His foot had become wedged between two heavy branches when he tried to retrieve his makeshift sword after tossing it playfully into the undergrowth, and he had been unable to free himself for nearly an hour, growing increasingly frightened and cold as the afternoon wore on. "Help! Somebody help me!" Thomas's small voice called out, cracking with barely suppressed tears, as the Duchess pushed through the undergrowth toward the sound. "I am here," the Duchess said, her usual commanding composure entirely abandoned in the face of the boy's evident distress. She knelt immediately beside him, careful of her fine traveling clothes now certainly ruined by the damp earth, and began working to free his trapped foot with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain calm for his sake. "You are quite safe now, Thomas. I have you." "I got lost," Thomas admitted through tears, wincing as she carefully worked the branch away from his ankle. "I was chasing a rabbit, and then I could not remember which way led back to the orchard, and my foot got stuck, and I was so frightened no one would ever find me." "I found you," the Duchess said firmly, finally freeing his foot and gathering the trembling boy into her arms with an instinct that seemed to surprise even herself. "And I do not intend to let anything happen to you. Do you understand? Not while I am here." She carried him the considerable distance back toward the manor herself, refusing the assistance of a groundskeeper who arrived moments later, her earlier composure entirely replaced by fierce, protective determination that Alexander had never witnessed in his mother before. When they finally reached the stable yard, Elena's cry of relief echoed across the courtyard, and she rushed forward to take Thomas from the Duchess's arms, checking him frantically for any injury while tears of relief streamed down her own face. "His ankle may be slightly bruised," the Duchess said, her voice still unsteady from the ordeal, "but I believe otherwise he is simply frightened and exhausted, rather than seriously harmed. He was calling for help when I found him, near the old badger's den by the eastern boundary." "Thank you," Elena said, looking up at the Duchess with genuine, unguarded gratitude that transcended entirely the tension that had defined their every previous interaction. "Thank you for finding him." The Duchess said nothing immediately, watching as Elena held Thomas close, the boy's small arms wrapped tightly around his mother's neck, as his tears finally began to subside into exhausted hiccups. Alexander approached slowly, his own relief evident in every line of his body, and found his mother's expression uncharacteristically open, stripped of its usual guarded composure by the fear she had clearly experienced during those frantic minutes searching for a child she had known for barely 2 weeks. "You carried him the entire way yourself," Alexander said quietly, understanding the significance of this gesture, even if his mother herself had not yet fully processed it. "I could not simply leave him there, frightened and alone, waiting for someone else to manage the task," the Duchess replied, though her voice lacked its usual sharp certainty. "Whatever else remains unresolved between us, Alexander, I would not wish harm upon that child. Watching him trapped and frightened beneath that log, calling out for help that seemed so long in arriving, I felt something considerably more urgent than any legal consideration or family reputation could possibly compete with." That evening, once Thomas had been settled safely into bed, with a warm ankle wrap and an extra story from Elena to help ease his lingering fright, the Duchess sought out Alexander privately once more, her expression carrying a weariness that seemed to have aged her considerably within the span of a single afternoon. "I believe," she said quietly, "that I no longer require the remainder of the week to reach my decision." "I believe," the Duchess said quietly, "that I no longer require the remainder of the week to reach my decision." She stood near the library window, the last light of evening catching the silver strands of her hair, and Alexander held his breath, uncertain whether he was about to hear the resolution he had hoped for, or a final, formal refusal delivered with all the weight of her considerable authority. This afternoon, carrying that child through the woods, frightened for his safety, in a way I have not felt frightened for anyone since your own father lay dying 18 months ago, I understood something I had been refusing to see clearly since my arrival, the Duchess continued. I have spent so many years protecting this family's name that I very nearly sacrificed an innocent child to preserve an idea, a reputation that means considerably less than his safety and happiness ought to mean to any woman who calls herself his grandmother. Alexander remained silent, sensing that whatever she needed to say required space rather than interruption, and the Duchess continued, her voice growing steadier with each word, as though she were finally settling into a decision she had perhaps already known was correct, even before circumstances forced her to admit it fully. "I will withdraw the legal inquiries I initiated," she said, "and I will not stand in the way of your marriage to Elena, nor of Thomas's legitimization as your son and rightful heir. I cannot promise you that every relation among our peers will accept this decision graciously, Alexander. There will be whispers, certainly, and perhaps some doors that once opened easily to this family will close more firmly than before, but I find, having nearly lost that boy this very afternoon, that such consequences matter considerably less to me than they did only yesterday." Relief flooded through Alexander so powerfully that he found himself momentarily unable to speak, his throat tight with an emotion he had not expected to feel so intensely, even after weeks of hoping for exactly this outcome. "Thank you, Mother," he said finally, his voice rough. "You do not know what this means, both to me and to Thomas." "I believe I am beginning to understand," the Duchess said, something almost like a genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth, an expression Alexander could not remember seeing on her face in longer than he cared to admit. "Though I confess, this shift has not come easily, nor without considerable internal struggle on my part. 30 years of careful tradition does not simply dissolve overnight, Alexander, regardless of how thoroughly a small boy's tears manage to pierce through it." "He asked me once whether you would like him," Alexander said quietly, remembering that conversation beneath the apple tree with sudden clarity. "I told him I did not know, but that whatever you decided, I liked him very much indeed, and nothing would change that." "Tell him," the Duchess said, "that his grandmother likes him a great deal as well, more than she expected to, and considerably more than she believes wise to admit so plainly, though I find myself unable to help it regardless." Alexander could not resist a small, genuine laugh at this admission, the first true laughter he had shared with his mother in longer than he could remember. "I will tell him," he promised, "though I suspect, given how thoroughly he charmed you within their first meeting alone, he already suspects the truth of it." The following morning, word spread quickly across the estate of the Duchess's decision, carried first through the household staff, and then rippling outward into the village itself, where speculation had been building steadily since Alexander's return weeks earlier. Elena received the news directly from Alexander himself, arriving at her cottage at first light, with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that she knew immediately something significant had shifted. "She has agreed," Alexander said, before Elena could even ask the question forming on her lips. "My mother has withdrawn her legal inquiries entirely, Elena. She will not stand against our marriage, nor against Thomas's legitimization. Whatever consequences follow among society's opinion, she has decided they matter considerably less than what nearly happened yesterday in those woods." Elena's hands flew to her mouth, tears gathering instantly in her eyes. 5 years of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. Like a weight she had carried for so long, she had nearly forgotten what its absence might feel like. "Truly?" she asked, needing to hear the confirmation once more before allowing herself to fully believe it. "Truly," Alexander confirmed, pulling her into an embrace that she returned fiercely, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously in the doorway of the small cottage that had witnessed so much heartache and hope over the preceding weeks. "We can build the life we should have built 5 years ago, Elena. All of us, together, without fear hanging constantly over every decision we make." Thomas, woken by the commotion, appeared at the top of the small staircase in his nightclothes, rubbing sleep from his eyes with obvious confusion at his parents' emotional display. "Why is Mama crying?" he asked, his voice thick with the particular concern only children show when adults display feelings they do not yet fully understand. "Happy tears, my love," Elena assured him quickly, wiping her eyes and holding out her arms to gather him close. "Your grandmother has decided she would very much like you to remain part of this family, permanently and completely, and your father and I intend to marry, if that news pleases you." Thomas's sleepy confusion transformed instantly into delighted excitement. "Does that mean I get to live at the big house?" he asked, already imagining the possibilities such a change might bring. "Will I have my own horse, like Papa's?" "In time, perhaps," Alexander said, laughing warmly at his son's immediate and entirely practical priorities. "For now, simply know that we will all be together, properly, as a family should be." The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Banns read at the village church, a modest but joyful wedding ceremony arranged for the following month, and careful legal arrangements made to formally establish Thomas as Alexander's legitimate son and heir. The Duchess, true to her word, threw her considerable influence behind smoothing whatever social difficulties arose from the arrangement, writing carefully worded letters to key family friends and acquaintances that framed the marriage as a long-delayed correction to circumstances, rather than a scandal requiring apology. Not everyone among the family's social circle received the news graciously. Several distant relations wrote sharply worded letters expressing their disapproval, and a few long-standing invitations to prominent social gatherings quietly ceased to arrive as they once had. But Alexander found, much to his own surprise, that such losses troubled him considerably less than he might once have imagined. The genuine happiness he had found with Elena and Thomas, far outweighing whatever social standing had been sacrificed to achieve it. Lord Harold Pembroke, upon hearing the news of the impending marriage, called upon Elena one final time, his manner gracious, despite the evident disappointment still lingering behind his kind eyes. "I wish you every happiness, Elena," he said sincerely, "and I hope you know that whatever affection I once held for you, I am glad to see Thomas finally receiving the father he has always deserved." "Thank you, Harold," Elena said, genuinely touched by his generosity of spirit. "Your friendship has meant a great deal to me these past months, and I hope we may remain friends, regardless of how circumstances have unfolded." "Always," Harold promised, before departing Ravenswood for the final time as a suitor, though he remained, in the years that followed, a welcome and valued friend to the family he had once hoped to join through marriage instead. Not every challenge to the family's decision came wrapped in polite disapproval and cooled invitations. Barely a week before the wedding was set to take place, a distant cousin of Alexander's late father, a man named Reginald Ashcombe, who held a modest estate 2 counties away, and had long harbored quiet ambitions regarding the family title, arrived at Ravenswood uninvited, his manner carrying none of the graciousness the family's closer relations had at least attempted to maintain. "I have come," Reginald announced, refusing the offer of tea and standing stiffly in the manor's entrance hall, as though eager to depart the moment his business concluded, "because I believe this family stands upon the verge of a considerable and entirely avoidable scandal, one that threatens not only your own standing, Alexander, but the standing of every branch of this family tree, myself included. I fail to see how my marriage concerns your particular branch of this family tree, Reginald, Alexander replied evenly, though he felt his earlier hard-won peace beginning to fray at the edges of this unwelcome intrusion. It concerns me a great deal, Reginald said sharply, given that should you fail to produce a legitimate heir through proper channels, the title itself might eventually pass to my own line. I have no wish to see that possibility complicated by a boy of questionable legitimacy, suddenly inserted into the succession through your mother's apparent softening of judgment. Thomas's legitimacy will be entirely established through our marriage, Alexander said, his voice hardening considerably. There is nothing questionable about it whatsoever, once the ceremony has taken place. Marriages after the fact do not always satisfy every legal challenge that might arise, particularly should other interested parties choose to contest the matter before the appropriate courts, Reginald said, his tone carrying an unmistakable threat beneath its formal phrasing. I have already consulted with lawyers of my own regarding the precise legal standing of such retroactive legitimization. The matter is considerably less settled than you appear to believe. Alexander felt a fresh surge of anger at this unwelcome complication, arriving so close to the wedding he and Elena had worked so hard to reach. But before he could respond further, the Duchess herself appeared in the entrance hall, having overheard enough of the exchange from the adjoining sitting room to understand precisely what Reginald intended. Reginald, she said coolly, her presence immediately shifting the entire tenor of the conversation. I was not aware you took such a close interest in matters concerning my son's household. Your Grace, Reginald said, his confidence faltering slightly beneath the Duchess's sharp, assessing gaze, clearly having not anticipated her direct involvement in what he had perhaps hoped to present as a private matter between himself and Alexander alone. I simply wish to ensure the family's interests remain properly protected, given the unusual circumstances currently unfolding. How thoughtful of you, the Duchess said, her tone carrying a chill that made even Alexander grateful he was not the target of her displeasure. Though I confess myself curious, Reginald, precisely how you came to learn of these unusual circumstances, in such thorough detail so quickly, given that the arrangements have only recently been settled within this household itself. Reginald's composure wavered further under her pointed question. Word travels quickly among family circles, Your Grace, he said, though his answer lacked conviction. Indeed it does, the Duchess replied. Particularly, I imagine, when certain family members maintain correspondence specifically designed to alert them to any opportunity that might advance their own position within the succession, regardless of the cost to their relations' happiness. I would advise you, Reginald, to consider very carefully whether pursuing this matter further truly serves your own interests, as well as you currently believe it does. This family's resources, legal and otherwise, remain considerably more substantial than your own, should you insist upon forcing a genuine contest, rather than accepting what has already been properly decided. The threat, delivered with the same icy precision that had once made the Duchess such a formidable presence throughout Alexander's own childhood, achieved its intended effect. Reginald's bluster deflated visibly, and he departed Ravenswood shortly afterward, with considerably less confidence than he had arrived with, his legal challenges apparently abandoned before they had ever truly begun. Thank you, Alexander said quietly, once his cousin's carriage had disappeared down the long gravel drive, for standing with us against him. I have decided which battles matter to me, Alexander, the Duchess replied simply. Protecting my grandson's rightful place within this family has become considerably more important to me than preserving the comfort of relations who see him merely as an obstacle to their own ambitions. Reginald will not trouble you further, I suspect, though I would advise remaining vigilant regardless. Not every distant relation will accept this decision as gracefully as I eventually managed to. With that particular threat neutralized, the household returned to the joyful preparations for the approaching wedding, though the encounter served as a sobering reminder that not every obstacle standing between Alexander's family and their hard-won happiness had yet been fully overcome. As the wedding day approached, Alexander found himself standing once more in the orchard where his story with Elena had first begun so many years earlier, watching Thomas practice his sword fighting against the same apple trees that had witnessed their earliest courtship. The boy had grown noticeably more confident in recent weeks, secure now in a certainty of belonging that had perhaps been missing from his young life before. and Alexander felt a fierce, protective love swell within his chest at the sight of his son so thoroughly at peace with his place in the world. "You look thoughtful," Elena said, joining him at the orchard's edge, her hand finding his easily now, the hesitation that had once characterized their interactions, replaced by a comfortable familiarity that felt like coming home after a long and difficult journey. "I am simply grateful," Alexander said, turning to face her fully. "For every difficult step that led us here, Elena, I do not regret the pain of these past 5 years, any less for how they resolved, but I find myself endlessly thankful that we found our way back to each other, regardless of everything that stood between us." "As am I," Elena said softly, leaning into his shoulder as they watched their son continue his imaginary battle beneath the very trees where their story had first taken root. Whatever difficulties still lay ahead, whatever adjustments remained necessary as their small family settled fully into its new circumstances, both of them understood clearly now that they faced those challenges together, bound by love that had proven, in the end, considerably stronger than 5 years of separation and fear had ever managed to break. Mrs. Dunmore, watching the small family from the manor's kitchen window as she prepared the evening meal, allowed herself a rare, satisfied smile at the sight. She had served this household through its darkest years, through the old Duke's declining health, through Alexander's sudden departure and the long, quiet grief that had followed in his absence, and through Elena's determined, solitary effort to raise her son with dignity, despite every hardship placed before her. To see the family whole again, gathered beneath the same orchard trees that had witnessed both their heartbreak and their reunion, felt to her like the closing of a long and difficult chapter, one she had privately feared might never reach so hopeful a conclusion. Whatever remained ahead for Alexander, Elena, and their son, she suspected it would be built upon a foundation considerably sturdier than the one that had so easily crumbled 5 years before. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the small village church's windows in warm golden beams that seemed, to Elena, like a blessing upon a day she had once believed would never come. She stood in a small side room adjoining the chapel, her simple ivory dress catching the light as Mrs. Dunmore fussed over the final arrangement of flowers woven through her hair, her hands trembling slightly with a nervousness that had nothing to do with doubt and everything to do with the sheer weight of finally receiving something she had long since stopped allowing herself to hope for. "You look radiant," Mrs. Dunmore said, stepping back to admire her handiwork with evident pride. "The Duke will not know what to do with himself when he sees you walking toward him." "I still cannot quite believe this is truly happening," Elena admitted, smoothing her hands nervously over the fabric of her dress. 5 years ago, I stood in this very village, watching him ride away, certain I would never see him again, certain I would raise our son entirely alone, with nothing but memories, to sustain me through the difficult years ahead. Now here I am, preparing to become his wife in truth, with his entire family gathered to witness it. "Life has a curious way of finding its proper course eventually," Mrs. Dunmore said gently, "even when the path there proves considerably more difficult than anyone deserves. You have earned this happiness many times over, Elena, through every hardship you endured raising that remarkable boy alone." A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Thomas appeared in the doorway, dressed in a small, formal suit that made him look, Elena thought with a rush of affection, considerably older than his 5 years, though his excited grin remained entirely childlike in its unguarded joy. "Mama, you look like a princess," he announced, bounding into the room, despite Mrs. Dunmore's gentle scolding about wrinkling his careful attire. "Papa says I get to walk you down to him. Is that truly allowed?" "It is more than allowed," Elena said, kneeling carefully, despite her dress, to look her son directly in the eyes. "It is exactly what I want, Thomas. There is no one in this world I would rather have walk beside me today." Thomas beamed at this, and when the moment finally arrived for Elena to make her way down the small church aisle, he took her hand with surprising solemnity, matching his small steps carefully to hers, as they walked together toward the front of the chapel, where Alexander waited, his expression carrying such open, unguarded emotion that Elena felt her own eyes fill with tears before she had even reached him. The church was filled beyond what Elena had expected, not only with the household staff who had watched this story unfold over the preceding weeks, but with villagers who had known Elena for years, offering their quiet support despite whatever gossip had once circulated about her circumstances. Edward Blackwood stood proudly beside Alexander as his chosen witness, and even Lord Harold Pembroke had accepted the invitation Elena extended, sitting near the back of the chapel with genuine warmth in his expression, despite the personal disappointment he had long since made peace with. The Duchess Beatrice Ashcombe sat in the front pew, dressed in deep, elegant colors befitting the occasion. And though her expression remained composed throughout the ceremony, Alexander caught her dabbing carefully at the corner of her eye during the vows, a gesture so uncharacteristic of the formidable woman he had known his entire life that it nearly undid his own composure entirely. The vicar spoke the familiar words of the ceremony, and when the moment came for Alexander to speak his own vows, his voice carried a steadiness that surprised even himself. 5 years of regret and longing, finally finding their proper resolution in the promises he made before the small gathered crowd. "I failed you once, Elena," he said, departing slightly from the traditional phrasing, to speak directly to the truth of their journey together. "I let fear and duty pull me away from the only love that ever truly mattered to me, and I have spent every day since regretting that choice, more deeply than words can properly express. I promise you now, before everyone gathered here to witness it, that I will never make that mistake again. Whatever challenges we face in the years ahead, I intend to face them standing firmly beside you and our son, for as long as I am given breath to do so." Elena's tears fell freely now, though her smile remained radiant throughout, and when her turn came to speak her own vows, her voice carried the quiet strength that had sustained her through 5 difficult years alone. "I never stopped loving you, Alexander, even through the years when I believed you had abandoned us entirely without cause," she said. "I raised our son on memories of the man I once knew you to be, hoping desperately that man still existed, somewhere beneath whatever fear had driven you away. Today I am endlessly grateful to discover that hope was not misplaced. I promise to build with you, from this day forward, the family we should have had all along." Thomas, standing between them holding the small ring cushion with careful concentration, looked up at both his parents with open, delighted curiosity throughout the entire exchange, utterly captivated by the solemnity of the occasion despite understanding only a fraction of its true significance. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer rose from the gathered crowd that seemed to shake the very rafters of the small chapel, and Thomas, unable to contain his excitement any longer, threw his arms around both his parents' legs simultaneously, declaring loudly that this was the very best day of his entire life. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, held in the manor's largest hall, decorated simply but beautifully, with flowers gathered from Elena's own garden and the estate's grounds. Villagers and household staff mingled freely with the small gathering of family and friends, and the usual rigid formality that typically governed such Ashcombe family occasions seemed, for once, entirely absent, replaced by genuine warmth and celebration that touched every corner of the gathering. The Duchess approached Elena during a quiet moment in the evening's festivities, her expression carrying a warmth that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, drawing Elena slightly aside from the main gathering, "for the manner in which I treated you upon my arrival, and for the pain my earlier actions caused you both, years before you ever knew the truth of my involvement. I cannot undo those 5 lost years, Elena, but I intend to spend whatever years remain to me, ensuring you and Thomas never again doubt your place within this family." "Thank you, Your Grace," Elena said, genuinely touched by this admission from a woman she had once believed entirely incapable of such vulnerability. "Thomas is fortunate to have a grandmother who cared enough, in the end, to fight for his place among us, rather than against it." "Please," the Duchess said, something almost shy entering her usually commanding manner, "I believe, given the circumstances, you might simply call me Beatrice, if you find that more comfortable than the formal address I imagine has grown tiresome between us." Elena smiled warmly at this small but significant gesture. "Beatrice, then," she agreed. Earlier that afternoon, before the celebration had reached its full height, Alexander had gathered the small group of witnesses required to formally sign the legitimization documents that would establish Thomas's rightful place within the family line. The county solicitor Edward had recommended, a careful and thorough man named Mr. Fenwick, had traveled to Ravenswood specifically for the occasion, spreading the necessary papers across a small table set up in the manor's study. Everything appears in perfect order, Mr. Fenwick confirmed, reviewing the documents one final time before offering Alexander the pen. Once signed and properly witnessed, young Thomas's position as your legitimate heir will be entirely secure, regardless of whatever objections distant relations might still harbor privately. Alexander signed his name with a steady hand, feeling the significance of the moment settle over him fully, as ink met paper, formalizing in law what he had already committed to in his heart weeks earlier. Elena signed beside him, her own signature slightly less practiced but no less determined, and the Duchess, standing as the formal witness required by law, added her own name with a flourish that carried none of the hesitation she had shown upon her initial arrival at Ravenswood. "There," Mr. Fenwick said, sealing the documents carefully into a leather folder for safekeeping. "Master Thomas Ashcombe is now, in every legal sense, exactly what he has always been in truth, your son, and heir to this family's title and estate." Thomas, who had been permitted to watch the proceedings despite understanding little of their actual significance, tugged eagerly at Alexander's sleeve. "Does this mean I am truly a knight now, Papa, a proper one, with a real title?" "In time, you shall carry a proper title indeed," Alexander said, laughing warmly, despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Though I suspect you shall always remain, first and foremost, the bravest knight of Ravenswood's Orchard, regardless of whatever formal titles follow later in life." Thomas seemed thoroughly satisfied with this assurance, and the small group had proceeded to the chapel shortly afterward for the wedding ceremony itself, the legitimization now formally settled before Alexander and Elena ever exchanged their vows before the gathered community. During the evening celebration, once the meal had concluded and the musicians hired for the occasion began their first gentle tunes, Edward Blackwood rose to offer a toast, his glass raised high as the room quieted to listen. "I have known Alexander since we were boys together, running wild through these very orchards, long before either of us understood the weight of duty or title," Edward began, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "I watched him leave this place 5 years ago, and I confess I feared, during those long years of his absence, that whatever joy once defined him had been lost entirely to distance and regret. Tonight, watching him stand beside Elena and their remarkable son, I am reminded that some bonds prove simply too strong for even the deepest fear to break permanently. To Alexander and Elena, and to young Thomas, the bravest knight Ravenswood has ever known, may your family's happiness prove as enduring as the very trees that first brought you together." The room erupted in warm applause, and Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion as he raised his own glass in response, Elena's hand warm and steady in his own throughout the toast. Villagers who had once whispered uncertainly about Elena's circumstances now raised their own glasses freely, the earlier gossip and judgment seemingly dissolved entirely in the face of such evident, genuine joy uniting the small community around them. Later still, as the dancing began in earnest, Alexander noticed his mother sitting somewhat apart from the main celebration, watching the festivities with an expression of quiet, contemplative satisfaction he had rarely witnessed in her before. He approached and extended his hand, a silent invitation she accepted with visible surprise. "I do not believe you have ever asked me to dance before, Alexander," the Duchess said, as he led her carefully onto the floor among the other celebrating couples. "I do not believe I have ever had quite so much reason to celebrate before," Alexander replied, guiding her through the steps of a dance she executed with the same practiced elegance she brought to everything she undertook. "Thank you, Mother, for finding the courage to change your mind, even after 30 years of believing certain things could never be otherwise." "Thank you," the Duchess replied, "for having the courage to challenge me in the first place. I do not believe I would have found my own way to this conclusion, had you not stood so firmly against everything I once believed necessary to protect." They danced together in comfortable silence for the remainder of the song, and when it concluded, the Duchess surprised him further by seeking out Thomas, who had been permitted to stay awake far past his usual bedtime given the occasion's significance, and requesting a dance of her own with her grandson. Thomas accepted with delighted enthusiasm, standing on his grandmother's feet as she guided him carefully through a simplified version of the steps, both of them laughing at his clumsy attempts to keep proper rhythm. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Alexander found a quiet moment alone with his new wife near the manor's terrace. the stars beginning to emerge overhead as the last light of day faded entirely from the sky. Thomas had finally succumbed to exhaustion after hours of excited celebration, currently asleep in Mrs. Dunmore's careful arms nearby, his small face peaceful in a manner that spoke of complete contentment. "We did it," Elena said softly, leaning into Alexander's embrace as they watched the stars appear, one by one, above the orchard's dark silhouette. "Despite everything working against us, despite 5 years of separation, and your mother's fierce opposition, we finally arrived here together." "We did," Alexander agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "And I intend to spend the rest of our lives together, making certain neither you nor Thomas ever doubts, even for a single moment, exactly how deeply and completely you are both loved." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars multiply overhead, both of them finally, fully at peace after a journey that had tested every ounce of courage and resolve they possessed. Whatever challenges the future held, they understood now that they would face them together, bound by a love that had proven, through every difficult trial, considerably stronger than the fear and distance that had once threatened to keep them apart forever. A single letter arrived the following morning, delivered quietly to Alexander's study, while the household still slept off the joyful exhaustion of the previous evening's celebration. It bore Reginald's seal, and Alexander opened it with cautious wariness, uncertain whether his cousin intended one final attempt at interference, now that the wedding had already taken place. Instead, he found a brief, grudging note acknowledging that the legitimization papers, properly signed and witnessed before the marriage itself, left no meaningful legal ground for further challenge, and that Reginald therefore considered the matter closed. It was not an apology, nor any expression of goodwill, but it was, Alexander recognized with quiet relief, the end of one final thread of uncertainty that might otherwise have lingered to trouble their newfound happiness. He folded the letter away and looked out his study window toward the orchard, where Thomas had already risen despite the late night before, chasing the estate's small terrier through the rows of apple trees with the same boundless energy that had first drawn Alexander's heart toward him weeks earlier. Whatever remained ahead for their family, Alexander felt certain now that they had weathered the most difficult storms already, and that the peaceful morning stretching before him represented not merely a single happy day, but the true beginning of the life he had always been meant to build. 3 years passed at Ravenswood, each season bringing its own quiet rhythm to a household that had finally settled into the peace Alexander and Elena had worked so hard to secure. The orchard where Thomas had first captured his father's heart with a wooden sword and an unguarded question now bore witness to an entirely different kind of gathering, one filled with laughter rather than uncertainty, with settled contentment rather than the fragile hope that had once characterized every conversation held beneath its branches. Thomas, now 8 years old and considerably taller than the small boy who had once demanded Alexander serve as his second in command, had grown into a thoughtful and confident child, secure in his place within the family that had once seemed so uncertain to claim him. He still visited the orchard often, though his imaginary battles had gradually given way to genuine interests in horsemanship and the estate's daily operations, following Edward Blackwood around the stables with an eager curiosity that reminded Alexander constantly of his own boyhood fascination with the workings of Ravenswood. A new addition had joined the family the previous spring, a daughter named Margaret, born with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady gray eyes, and named in quiet tribute to the grandmother who had come to adore both her grandchildren, with a warmth that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those first tense days of the Duchess's arrival years earlier. Thomas had taken to his role as older brother with tremendous seriousness, insisting on personally teaching baby Margaret every important skill he considered essential, from the proper way to skip stones across the stream to the correct manner of addressing an imaginary dragon, should one ever threaten the orchard's peace. The Duchess, who now spent considerably more time at Ravenswood than her previous visits had ever suggested she might, had become a fixture in both children's lives, her formidable reputation among the wider family softened considerably by the genuine devotion she showed her grandchildren. She often could be found in the garden with Thomas, teaching him patiently about the estate's history and the responsibilities that would eventually fall to him as the future Duke, her lessons delivered with far more warmth than the rigid formality that had once defined her approach to nearly everything else in her life. "You have changed her," Elena observed one afternoon, watching from the terrace as the Duchess demonstrated proper posture for young Thomas's riding lessons. Her patience, seemingly endless, despite the boy's occasional clumsy missteps. "I do not believe I would recognize the woman who first arrived here," threatening to erase Thomas from any claim upon this family entirely. "I believe Thomas changed her considerably more than I ever could have managed alone," Alexander replied, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. There is something about a child's unguarded trust that manages to reach places even the most determined adult resolve cannot quite protect against forever. Lord Harold Pembroke remained, as promised, a steady and welcome friend to the family. His own life having taken a happier turn the previous year, when he married a widow from a neighboring county, a woman whose gentle warmth had gradually eased whatever lingering disappointment remained from his earlier hopes regarding Elena. He visited Ravenswood often, and Thomas had grown particularly fond of Harold's own young stepson, the two boys forming an easy friendship that pleased everyone who witnessed it. Edward Blackwood continued his role as the estate's steward, his skill at managing Ravenswood's affairs having grown only more valuable as the years passed, and his friendship with Alexander remained as steady and genuine as it had been throughout every difficult trial the family had faced together. He had become something of an honorary uncle to both children, and Thomas still occasionally referred to him with the same affectionate title he had used years earlier, a small habit that no longer caused Alexander even the briefest pang of discomfort, secure now in his own established role as father, in every sense that truly mattered. The village itself had long since embraced the family's story as one of its own quiet legends, the kind of tale mothers told their children on winter evenings, when the fire burned low and the wind rattled the shutters outside. Mrs. Fairweather, who still taught at the small schoolhouse Thomas had once attended, reluctantly, before his lessons expanded to include tutors at the manor itself, often spoke fondly of the shy, curious boy who had once sat in her classroom, never suspecting the important role he would eventually grow into. The bakery near the village square had even taken to naming a particular pastry after the family, a small apple tart that children particularly favored, and though Elena found the gesture faintly embarrassing whenever she visited the shop herself, she could not deny the warmth behind such simple, community-minded affection. The Duchess, for her part, had become something of an unexpected champion for other families in similar circumstances throughout the county, quietly using her considerable influence to smooth the path for at least two other children she learned of over the years, born outside the bounds of traditional marriage, yet deserving, in her firm estimation, of the same chance at legitimacy and belonging that Thomas had eventually received. She never spoke publicly of this quiet work, preferring instead to let her actions speak plainly enough on their own, though Alexander suspected she found in this small ongoing effort a way of making amends for the years she had spent believing rigid tradition mattered more than genuine happiness. "I sometimes wonder," the Duchess admitted to Alexander one afternoon, as they walked together through the estate's gardens while Thomas practiced his archery nearby under Edward's careful supervision, "how differently things might have unfolded had I possessed the wisdom 3 years ago that I have since gained through watching that boy grow into the fine young man he is becoming. I very nearly cost you both everything that matters most, Alexander, out of nothing more than fear dressed up as duty. You found your way to us in the end, Mother," Alexander said gently. "That matters considerably more than any delay along the path that brought you there. Thomas does not remember the uncertainty of those early weeks. He remembers only the grandmother who found him trapped and frightened in the woods, and who has loved him steadily and completely ever since. That is a kindness I do not entirely deserve," the Duchess said quietly, "though I intend to spend whatever years remain to me, proving myself worthy of it regardless." The archery lesson concluded with Thomas managing, to his tremendous delight, to strike the target's center ring for the first time, and his triumphant shout carried clearly across the garden, drawing smiles from both Alexander and his mother, as they watched the boy's unrestrained joy at the small accomplishment. That evening, as preparations for the family's simple orchard supper got underway, a letter arrived from London, bearing news that brought its own quiet satisfaction to the household. The solicitor Mr. Fenwick had written to confirm that Thomas's formal standing as heir to the Ashcombe title had been fully recorded and recognized within every relevant legal register, closing permanently any lingering question that might otherwise have shadowed his future. Alexander read the letter twice, before setting it carefully aside, feeling the last trace of old anxiety finally dissolve entirely, replaced by simple, settled certainty regarding his son's secure place in the world. He found Elena in the nursery, gently rocking Margaret to sleep in the soft evening light, and shared the news quietly, watching relief and quiet joy pass across her face in equal measure. "It is truly finished, then," she said softly. "Every question, every uncertainty, settled beyond any possibility of future challenge." "Truly finished," Alexander confirmed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, as Margaret finally settled into peaceful sleep against her mother's shoulder. "Whatever storms may come in the years ahead, Elena, they will not touch this particular foundation. Thomas's place here is entirely secure, exactly as it always should have been from the very beginning." They stood together for a quiet moment, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in the fading evening light, before making their way down to join Thomas and the rest of the family already gathering in the orchard for their planned supper beneath the apple trees. On a warm summer evening, much like the one that had first brought Alexander back to Ravenswood's gates 3 years earlier, the family gathered in the orchard for a simple supper, laid out upon blankets, spread beneath the same apple trees that had witnessed every turn of their story. Thomas ran ahead of the group, eager to show his grandmother a particularly impressive collection of stones he had gathered that week, while Alexander carried young Margaret carefully against his shoulder, her small fingers curled contentedly into the fabric of his coat. Elena walked beside him, watching their small family settle onto the blankets amid the golden evening light, and felt a contentment so complete it nearly overwhelmed her entirely. She thought back, as she often did during such peaceful moments, to the frightened, uncertain woman who had once stood in this very orchard, believing she would raise her son entirely alone, never suspecting that the man she loved would eventually return to claim his place beside them both. "Do you remember?" she said softly, settling beside Alexander as he lowered himself carefully onto the blanket, mindful of Margaret still nestled against his shoulder. "The very first evening you met Thomas here, when he asked why your eyes looked so familiar." "I remember every detail of that evening," Alexander said, smiling at the memory, despite the anxiety it had once carried. "I have never been more frightened in my entire life than I was standing here, realizing exactly what those gray eyes meant." "And now look at us," Elena said, gesturing toward Thomas, who had convinced the Duchess to help him arrange his stones into an elaborate pattern, while Edward looked on with amused patience nearby. "An entire family, gathered beneath these same trees, exactly as it should have been all along." "Exactly as it should have been," Alexander agreed, reaching for her hand, as the evening light deepened into the soft gold of approaching sunset. "Though I confess, Elena, I would not trade even the difficult years that led us here, painful as they were. They taught me exactly how precious this ordinary happiness truly is, something I fear I might have taken entirely for granted, had our path here been simpler." Elena had continued her work as the estate's herbalist even after becoming Duchess in her own right, refusing to abandon entirely the quiet satisfaction she found in tending the gardens and preparing remedies for the village families who still sought her expertise, much to the surprise of certain distant relations who believed such practical labor beneath her new station. Alexander had never once suggested she abandon the work, understanding well enough that Elena's sense of purpose ran deeper than any title could satisfy on its own, and the arrangement suited them both perfectly. She spent her mornings among her herbs and her afternoons with the children, and the villagers, who once whispered about her circumstances, now greeted her warmly whenever she passed through the market square. Her past struggles transformed gradually into a story of quiet, hard-won triumph rather than shame. Baby Margaret, still too young to understand the significance of the gathering unfolding around her, gurgled happily from her carefully arranged nest of blankets, reaching small fingers toward the apple blossoms drifting occasionally down from the branches overhead. The Duchess settled beside her with evident delight, having grown considerably more comfortable with infants than her earlier reserved demeanor might once have suggested possible, murmuring soft nonsense words that made the baby laugh with unrestrained delight. Edward Blackwood arrived slightly later than the rest, having remained behind to settle the horses for the evening, and accepted the plate of food Elena offered with a grateful nod, settling onto the blanket beside Thomas, with the easy familiarity of a man who had become as much a part of this family as any blood relation might have been. He had never married himself, content instead with the steady rhythms of estate life and the deep friendship he shared with Alexander, and the children had come to treat him with the same casual affection they showed their own parents, a fact that pleased him more than he ever openly admitted. Tell me honestly, Edward, Alexander said, as the meal wound down and the evening light deepened further toward true dusk. Did you ever imagine, watching me ride away from this place 5 years before Thomas was born, that we would eventually find our way to an evening exactly like this one? Edward considered the question thoughtfully, before answering, watching Thomas attempt to teach his baby sister the proper grip for holding a wooden sword, an effort that mostly resulted in Margaret simply gumming happily at the toy's handle instead. I confess I did not, he admitted. I feared, during those long years of your absence, that whatever happiness you once possessed here had been lost entirely to distance and regret, much as I told you the evening you first returned. But I have learned, watching your family these past 3 years, that some bonds prove simply too essential to remain broken forever, regardless of how thoroughly circumstance and fear conspire to separate them. Thomas, noticing his parents' quiet conversation, abandoned his stone arrangement momentarily and came bounding over to join them, settling himself comfortably between his mother and father, with the easy confidence of a child who had never once doubted, in all the years since that first evening in the orchard, exactly where he belonged. "Papa," he said, looking up with the same open curiosity that had first captured Alexander's heart 3 years earlier. "Will you tell me the story again? About the day you came back?" Alexander glanced at Elena, sharing a warm, knowing smile, before turning back to his son, gathering him closer against his side, as the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky above Ravenswood's orchard. "Of course," he said softly. "Every word of it, exactly as it happened." And there, beneath the same apple trees that had witnessed heartbreak and hope, separation and reunion, Alexander began telling his son the story of a duke who returned after 5 long years of quiet distance, and the small boy with his own eyes, who had asked, simply and honestly, why he looked so familiar, setting into motion a journey that would ultimately bring an entire family home.